Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Luis Simon. I'm the director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governance, which is where we are today. So welcome all to this timely event on transatlantic defense in an era of strategic competition, TIDE for short, which we are conducting in cooperation with CSIS and with NATO as well. So let me thank Max Bergmann, who's the director of the Europe program and Stuart Center at CSIS, and also the entire team at CSIS, as well as NATO, Nicola De Santis, head of engagements and NATO's public diplomacy division, and the PDD team. So we're very happy to be doing this with CSIS and with the Europe team, not least as I'm a senior associate with the Europe program. And thank you all very much for coming along today. This event is part of a project we are conducting. It's a one-year project titled TIDE, Transatlantic Defense in an Era of Strategic Competition. There will be a follow-on TIDE event in Washington in the fall. And we'll be publishing some policy papers on the back of both the Brussels and Washington events. This is fully on the record. So if you're on social media, please use the hashtag TIDE, which you should have there somewhere. No, you don't, but it's hashtag TIDE. So we take the Madrid strategic concept as a point of departure, which, as many of you know, sort of emphasizes the importance of preparing the alliance, adapting the alliance for an era of strategic competition. And central to this task, of course, is the need to revitalize deterrence and collective defense, but also more broadly to adapt to a world whose strategic center of gravity appears to be shifting towards the Indo-Pacific region in terms of military competition, economic growth, and technological innovation. And even if NATO's center of gravity remains, of course, the Euro-Atlantic, there's a need to understand how these broader changes, including China's strategic rise, may affect the international order as well as Euro-Atlantic security. So we have envisaged this first TIDE event, as a contribution to the upcoming NATO Summit in Vilnius that will take place next month, as many of you know, on the 11th and 12th of July. Hence our emphasis on burden sharing here today. As you know, the question of how to share the burden of security amongst NATO allies and more specifically between Europeans and Americans, is as old as NATO itself. But we've had a lot of burden sharing related discussions over the last few decades, particularly in the context of NATO's engagement in the Western Balkans, in Afghanistan, and more broadly when it comes to dealing with external crises and challenges like counterterrorism. But now we're beginning to talk about burden sharing in the context of strategic competition. And I think the TIDE project seeks to help unpack that conversation, that link between burden sharing and strategic competition specifically. So what does transatlantic burden sharing look like when the main referent is actually strategic competition, both at the strategic level, but also in key areas like defense planning, capability development, and technological innovation. So to unpack that big picture question, we've got two terrific panels and a great set of speakers. But before handing over to Max, let me just remind you that we will be sending you, and this is very important for NATO and therefore for us, we'll be sending you a short questionnaire via email after the event, and would really appreciate your take on and your input on the event. That's it from me. I hope you enjoy the event. Over to you, Max. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Luis. And I'll be very brief because we have a lot to discuss during the panel event. But first, let me just thank Luis and Daniel Fiat of CSDS. We've had a really great partnership with them between our two organizations, CSIS in Washington and CSDS here in Brussels. And I think it's really critical that we continue to have this sort of transatlantic conversation. Oftentimes we have it at the leader level, NATO summits, bilaterals between the American administration coming over and meeting with government officials, but it's critical important to also have that in a transatlantic context. And one of the things that I think is increasingly important about this is that it's happening between Brussels and the U.S. and gaining the European perspective here in Brussels, not just engaging with national capitals and the think tanks that exist in national capitals, but trying to also do that here in Brussels. And so I commend Luis on his effort to really build up CSDS, and I think It's really fantastic. And we also thank NATO for sponsoring and supporting this conversation. Again, I think that it really helps advance transatlantic cooperation. And I think we're sort of meeting and convening, I think, a really interesting moment. There's not only a counteroffensive occurring in Ukraine, but the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is in Beijing right now trying to manage a strategic competition with China, which for many in Washington, I think many around the world, has been really ramping up in its intensity and leads to new challenges that we probably haven't seen since the early days of the Cold War. And so with that, I think maybe I'll hand it back to Elise to hand it back to opening our panel.
Thanks, Max. It's a great pleasure. Not much to add from my side, really, other than to hand over to my good friend and colleague, Alexander Matelar, who's a Vice Dean for Research at the Brussels School of Governance and a prominent member of CSDS, as well as a Senior Fellow at Egmont. Alexander, and welcome again.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and welcome to this first panel debate on enhancing European responsibility. Let me start by echoing what was already mentioned by Lewis. It's such a pleasure to team up with the excellent colleagues from CSIS as one of the foremost think tanks in the Washington, D.C. scene. And let me also explicitly thank NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for making that partnership possible. As far as the topic of conversation now is concerned, we are finding ourselves in the direct run-up to the forthcoming NATO summit in Vilnius. The NATO defense ministers took stock of the latest preparations last week at the ministerial, reviewing the new set of regional defense plans that NATO military authorities have drawn up. And whoever says defense plans also has to think of, well, the resourcing that is required for making these plans come alive. And that will indeed be a very important topic of conversation because it brings out that notion of responsibility. SACEUR General Cavoli has now stated it on multiple occasions. We are moving towards a future where allies will be facing capability targets all derived from plans. And if they are not resourced, we have problems. So that is indeed a critical conversation to have, and I'm delighted that we're joined by such a distinguished set of panelists today. Going in the reverse order of the program, on the far left we have Gesine Weber from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We have Borja Lasheras from the Center for European Policy Analysis. On my immediate left, we have Cynthia Cook, who leads the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group of CSIS. Max Bergmann has already, of course, been introduced. And on my far right, Jordan Becker, who is a good friend of Team CSDS, having already participated in a whole range of our activities, but currently teaching at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I know that several of our speakers have also brought along a couple of illustration materials to discuss that topic of responsibility. So we'll jump right in. I look forward to an engaging debate. Jordan, over to you to kick us off.
All right, great. Hello. Should I go up there, or are we doing it from here? Let me go from here. Is this on? Okay, great. I don't think I need this, but do we need this for some kind of recording or something? Okay, so I'll use it. Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, I'm Jordan. I'm from West Point. A very important thing for you to know is that I'm not speaking on an official capacity. So what you hear from me is not U.S. government policy. It's just my thinking and research. Doesn't mean it's not right. Okay. So I think so. I've seen Cynthia and Gesine's slides, and I think this alphabetical order we're going in is going to work well for this, because what I'm going to do is kind of provide an overview of the data that we have now about burden sharing, which we're now calling responsibility sharing. It reflected quite well in SACEUR's comments about plans and resources. So what this visualization shows, and in the bottom is the article that you can reference if you want to look at it in more time or detail. But what it basically shows is that every ally except the United States has increased overall defense spending and defense spending on equipment modernization since the time of the Wales Pledge. What that tells me is essentially at the NATO level, the Wales Pledge has worked. There's a potential problem of endogeneity. There's an argument that, well, no, the Russia threat changed and it's because of that, and it didn't have anything to do with allies making agreements with one another. But I don't think that's right. That's not necessarily not right because of what you see here, but I think it's not right because of what you see here, which adds non-NATO EU members. So my thinking here is that if the increase in defense spending that you saw on the last slide since Wales was caused by the international strategic environment, then you would expect non-NATO EU members to increase defense spending in the same way that NATO members did, but they did not. Then you might think, well, Austria and Malta and Cyprus, why would they spend more on defense? There's a reason they're not in NATO. Yes, but what about Norway pardon me, what about Finland and Sweden? And it turns out that Finland and Sweden also behaved quite differently from Norway and Denmark. So my big takeaway here, all of these three visualizations are just there to show you that since 2014, the changes, there have been positive changes in defense spending. Is it enough? I don't think so. But it matters. And it matters because, as the illustrious and highly quotable Donald Rumsfeld once said, you go to war with the army you have. So NATO embarked on its support for Ukraine and its defense of itself against Russia with the forces and the resources that NATO had at the time. So very early in the Russia-Ukraine war, Alexander Lenoshka and I looked at the relationship between prior defense investment by NATO allies and support for Ukraine. And unsurprisingly, more investment before the war in Ukraine was positively correlated pretty strongly with more support for Ukraine. So basically that gets us up to the present. The Wales Pledge occurred in a very specific context, which was not quite as bellicose as today's context is. I think the Wales Pledge worked in that context. That context, many people are going to say that context is over. I am not totally sure that context is over. And I actually have a fear that if I am, say, a German politician who is still very uncomfortable with increased resources for defense, I might make an argument along the lines of, hey, look, the primary threat in Europe is Russia, and Russia can't even get a quarter of the way into Ukraine without breaking its own military. So maybe we're fine, right? And if we're not fine, the Americans will probably show up again. So it's not obvious to me that, it's obvious to me that the context is fundamentally changed, but it's not obvious to me that it's obvious to the people to whom it needs to be obvious that the context has fundamentally changed. And I think we need to see the data. So this first paper that I'm throwing up there, you'll see it has volume and issue 00 because it just came out. But it's some wonderful colleagues at CIPRI who have taken a look at defense spending trends in light of the Ukraine war. I don't think that we can even talk about defense spending trends in light of the Ukraine war because the last data we still have estimates from 2022, right? So NATO published the 2022 estimates summer of 22, and we'll get a first estimate of 23 spending, I think, at the Vilnius Summit. We should get it at the Vilnius Summit. So we don't really have the data yet. It's not obvious that there's been an increase in resource allocation. We're hearing a lot about it. There's rumors about it, but I like to wait until I've been shown the money. But those two articles I think are good resources to get the sort of zeitgeist about what's going on. But then there's this big question about regionalization and specialization, and my personal authority on that topic is Alexander. One of my all-time favorite articles on this topic was Alexander's article about sort of geographic planning, and I thought about it much more simply and less academically than Alexander has. But what I would always argue when I was working at NATO was that we should think about it like I was in the infantry and special forces before I became an academic, and so I spent a lot of time in the forest hiding from people and then shooting them when they walked by. In order to do that, you have to establish a patrol base, right? And in a patrol base in the woods, you find a covered and concealed location off of main avenues of approach, and you put your most casualty-producing weapons at the apexes of the patrol base. And it would be really, really stupid if every time something approached one of the sides of the patrol base, if everyone in the patrol base turned and walked over to where that approach was. It works much better if everyone covers their sector. And I think that's the sort of like Jordan knuckle-dragging infantryman version of Alexander's argument back in 2018, which is fantastic in 2018, and I think it's finally sort of filtered its way into NATO policy, as that General Cavoli quote demonstrates. So this was a challenge. So now I'll move from my academic work to my personal experience, which is a little bit dated. But I always struggled. I had this odd situation that had nothing to do with portfolio allocations in a normal world, but had everything to do with idiosyncrasies and personnel above my level. But I worked in both the Defense Policy Planning Committee and the Council Operations and Exercises Committee. And I was always astounded at what a huge gap there was between what we did in those two committees. And it was astounding to me that there was not this nice, clean causal diagram that I've drawn there between scenario planning, exercises, operational planning, defense planning, and resource allocation, right? Like we never talked about scenarios and operational planning in the DPPC. And I think that's changing, which is very good news, I think. And how it's changing and the details of its changing, the details of the changes, and also the defense industrial policy that underlies it will be for Cynthia. And then, by the way, the data that Gazine is going to show from the Kiel Institute is the data that underlay the analysis that Alexander and I did that you saw in that scatter plot. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over 7 minutes, or I hope I haven't gone too far over 7 minutes. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to be here. And I'll pass it back to...
Well timed, Jordan. Over to you, Max.
Great. Which mic should I use?
Whatever is most convenient, I think.
I'll hand that one back to you. Well, let me first just thank Jordan for that, I think, really insightful analysis. I mean, to me, I think the point you sort of left off with, I think, is whether the current environment will continue. And I think you're very right in pointing to the potential for European countries to point to the destruction of the Russian military that is currently taking place in Ukraine, or at very least the long time it will take for Russia to recapitalize its forces, at least to get back to anywhere close to what it was pre-February 2022. But I also think right now what you're seeing in a debate that's happening not at NATO, but across the way at the EU when it comes to the Stability and Growth Pact, when it comes to potential deficit reduction suddenly being back on the table of a priority of European governments. I sort of I find it very hard to see how an EU that is then reintroducing the Stability and Growth Pact to sort of return to more austere budgetary times will lend itself to an increase in defense spending, or at the very least, even maintaining the current levels that we currently have. And so I think that kind of highlights one of the major challenges of oftentimes when in Europe, the economic side of the house is not as coordinated with the security side of the house, in part because they're in different houses. And I think it's time for more for the EU and NATO to begin to have closer collaboration. We at CSIS last week released a new report called Transforming European Defense, a new focus on integration. And I think what Jordan points to is that there's been a real increase in defense spending across Europe over the last decade since the Wales Pledge. And I think what you're about to see are huge commitments, and you're seeing huge commitments for an increase. And I think many of those, despite my the things that I just said 20 seconds ago, I think much of that will materialize. The challenge I see is that it's one thing for NATO, European countries, and EU countries to spend marginally more on defense. Because if that occurs, then I think the broader impact on European security will be marginal, because the defense increases will be spread out amongst many countries. Perhaps you'll have forces that are a bit more ready to go. You'll have a bit more procurement. It will no doubt make European militaries stronger, and perhaps significantly stronger. But to me, one of the, I think, real challenges going forward is the lack of European defense cooperation and integration. One of our colleagues, Sean Monahan at CSIS, had a report earlier this year looking at European defense cooperation. And over the last decade, since Wales Pledge, and despite lots of emphasis on European defense cooperation, this is defense cooperation when it comes to the investment side, when buying equipment together, focusing resources in an integrated way, has declined over the last decade. So Europeans are spending more, but spending separately. And I think while that doesn't sort of preclude countries from operating together militarily, when you're not operating the same kit, it does make it harder. As we're seeing in Ukraine, when Ukraine now has to figure out how to maintain 4 or 5 different types of tanks on the front lines, it really adds to the burden on those forces. So I think one of the things that we identify in this report is the need to sort of refocus, I think, in addition to increase defense spending, to an increase in European defense cooperation, for Europeans to buy more together. And in that, we sort of, I think, identify a role for the EU to play, which, in some ways, the Best Think Tank report basically highlights something that's already happening. And what we've seen in response to this war is the EU beginning to play a role in coordinating Europe, or playing a role in European procurement, European defense. The European Peace Facility being used in an unprecedented way to mobilize 4 billion euros to basically backfill European countries that have given equipment away is one mechanism. But then the recent Estonian proposal, which I think is quite significant, then turning into an EU initiative to use the European Peace Facility funding to joint buy ammunition. And if you can buy ammunition together, then you can start buying other big things together as well. And one of the things we see with the Leopard tank is that when countries operate a common platform, it actually creates degrees of economies of scale. And I think all of those are important, and then point to a potential role for the EU. And this is, I think, where we begin to see the EU's comparative advantage when it comes to the defense investment side to NATO, and that is that the EU has a budget. It has a currency. It has the ability to borrow money. And it is shocking to me, really shocking to me, that Europe, in response to a pandemic, borrows 800 billion euros, but does not then borrow in response to war. And it's also sort of, I found it surprising that the United States didn't make that request. And I think part of the reason why we haven't made that request, and this is maybe where I'll close, is that the United States has seen the EU playing a role in defense as somehow automatically leading to the end of NATO, and the idea that this will lead to some sort of decoupling. The EU buying ammunition is not a problem. The EU conjuring resources through borrowing to incentivize defense cooperation. And frankly, I think part of what we point to in this report is the only way you're really going to get national ministries of defense to cooperate when it comes to procurement is to incentivize it. I can't imagine the Pentagon doing joint acquisition with other countries. It's just sort of mind-boggling to imagine that bureaucracy trying to coordinate itself with another bureaucracy. So it's not a surprise that, when the Danes want their coffee cup holder and their, vehicle to be on the left side, and the Germans want it on the right side, and then the Dutch decide they don't need a coffee cup holder. All of that then leads to procurement delays and different requirements. And so it's really hard, I think, especially when it comes to the defense investment side, to coordinate. But this is one of the things that the EU can do by incentivizing that cooperation. And I think part of it is the US sort of getting over some of our mental hurdles when it comes to the EU, and also when it comes to being concerned about the EU providing investment into European defense industries. And this is where I'll close. The United States has been very, wants to have to sell in Europe. My portfolio when I was at the State Department was doing essentially covering arms sales, which included to Europe. It's very easy to sell weapons to Europe relative to other regions of the world where we're much more restrictive because we're allies. We have trust. There's a technology that can be shared at a much higher level despite the concerns about ITAR. So it's a permissive environment for our defense companies, which then lowers costs for American industries, and that's good. That we tend to want that. Cynthia can talk more about that. However, we're also realizing that we want a vibrant European defense industrial base. That what we're seeing in Ukraine is they're figuring out ways to put munitions on systems that should never, U.S. anti-radiation missiles on a MiG-29 fighter jet. If the United States got into a conflict, by God, in the Indo-Pacific, we would need to rely, I think, on the European defense industrial base to provide things like munitions. And so this is sort of interchangeability that folks are talking about, I think, is really important. And that means that we need Europe to have a vibrant industrial base, even if it leads to perhaps, at the margins, fewer sales for American companies. I'll leave it at that.
Great. I'm going to hop up just so a few slides that way I can touch them. Right. I think I need a microphone too. Hello. So I feel like the last two speakers have totally set me up to do my slides. So thank you, Jordan and Max, and hopefully I will do the same for the next two speakers. I'm going to start off with a U.S. focused take on the defense industrial base, and then bring it around to Europe. There we go. So what have we seen post-war on U.S. Military spending? As one of the previous speakers said, it has actually been basically flat through the last year with only 1.1% real growth, and that is after you control for the fairly high rate of inflation we've seen. The material sent to Ukraine has, for the most part, come out of drawdowns rather than new contracts, and that's why we haven't seen an increase in government spending. This is changing in the first quarter of this year, particularly for munitions, but to get the industrial base primed to refill the warehouses with what was sent to Ukraine is going to be tough just because of constraints on the industrial base regarding capacity, workforce, and supply chain. So this next chart shows what the U.S. has obligated in contract spending over the last couple of decades since the turn of the millennium. And you can see it goes up and down over time with a drawdown during sequestration and then an increase over the last few years. Overall spending was flat in 2022 and has been flat for the first quarter of 2023, except for munitions, which has shown an increase. This does not include some spending, including Defense Production Act spending, and it also doesn't include spending on classified capabilities. But overall, this government spending data, as reported in the Federal Procurement Data System, is a terrific way of tracking trends over time. Plus, it's the best that we have. So there have been increases in spending in munitions post beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, including a big contract for the Gimlers. So why is it so difficult to increase production in the U.S.? That's because we've also had a revolution in manufacturing over the last 30 or so years that has yielded an extremely efficient defense industrial base, a low-cost defense industrial base, but a defense industrial base without a lot of slack. And that means that factories are set up to deliver what the Department of Defense needs at the lowest possible cost, and increasing is difficult. You might have to, if you do have room in your facility, you may have to add a third shift, which involves hiring new workers. You can engineer things for a bit, but that is just what you have in-house. That does not include the perhaps 70% of the value of the final good that comes from the supply chain. So you not only have to ramp up your own production, but the production of the supply chain, and that's if you have capacity in-house. If you want to build a new facility, or if you need to build a new facility, you can either do it right next door, which takes advantage of economies of scale and plant management, or you may want to spread the risk. For example, if you're in a hurricane-heavy area, you may want to build a factory someplace where they don't have hurricanes, just to reduce climate risk. And in any case, if you're going to build a new factory, you have to, hire an architect and contract for the building of the building. And oh, by the way, you better place your orders for new machine tools yesterday, because those can take a couple of years. Hire workers, increase the supply chain, and so on and so forth. So increasing defense manufacturing is not necessarily just a point of setting a requirement and sending money to your prime contractors. It can be very difficult and take a long time if they don't have the capacity. And that is what I think we're facing after the war, to refill the warehouses. It's not just a question of what happens in the commercial world. The Army in particular has a munitions, an organic munitions industrial base, and they are placing more money there. For example, the Scranton plant, which is run by General Dynamics, makes castings and machinings of artillery shells. There's others that make different parts of the final product. One thing to consider when you're increasing the production of munitions is that they're explosive. So you have to be careful about where you build your facilities and how close you put things together. You want to spread your munitions out as they cure, for example. So this does take space, and it's, again, not a simple question. So what can the U.S. Department of Defense do to increase capacity? One of the things that I've heard over and over again is the use of partner facilities in what is known as ally shoring, or more cheerfully as friend shoring. We should send some of our requirements overseas, for example, to Europe, which are close partners, to take advantage of any unused capacity, if such exists, in their factories, which does benefit from national interests in increasing their own manufacturing, doesn't solve the supply chain problem, and defense industrial cooperation, as Max mentioned, is not always so easy. The industrial bases of allied nations do offer a source of surge capacity, and I'm not going to brief this slide at length just in the interest of times, but I know that Dr. LaPlante, the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, has been working with the National Armaments directors in Europe to talk about increasing interchangeability and expanding production. The idea of ally shoring would benefit from the integration of European defense production, and I'm going to give a thought experiment on the next two slides that show why. But overall, big picture, the benefits could be greater efficiency for the industrial base. Different nations could engage in complementary investments, so one would focus on shipbuilding, another on tanks. It would increase interchangeability if folks cooperated more, and would strengthen partnerships. The challenges of cooperation are, of course, national interests, the difficulty of setting joint requirements. As Max described with his coffee cup example, there is frequently requirements creep that makes it hard to coordinate. And finally, just the difficulty of making the decisions of, where are these things going to be built? Everybody wants the jobs in their own country. So what we know from manufacturing is that the more you do, the more efficient you are at it, and this is called the learning curve. So this notional example, we're making some widgets where it takes 100 hours to make the first widget. The learning curve is 85%, and there's 3 small countries that need 1,000 widgets. So if they each have a manufacturing facility, it's going to take 25.86 hours on average to make these widgets. And hours are a pretty close correlation with how much these things cost. If 3 countries work together, it's less than 20 hours per widget, and if it's 8 countries that work together, it's less than 16 hours per widget. So you can see that coordination yields lower costs, and this could be lower costs for the same capability, or you can also think about it as increased capability for a fixed cost. Of course, there are investments in facilities which this doesn't capture, so the efficiencies go beyond the time it takes to make the products to a reduction in the overall infrastructure cost for the facilities. Now we'll see how a powerful ally changes the economics of cooperation. So let's say you have a notional large country, we call it the United States, and their production run is 10,000 items, so you can see they can produce something for 15 hours. Recall that a small country can do it for 25 hours. And if they consolidate, then it's less than 15 hours per unit. So this is a great deal for the small country. They get to benefit from the economies of scale in their large partner. It's also a better deal for the large partner. They get a benefit from exporting to smaller partners because costs go down for them as well. So the question is, countries working alone can absolutely see the benefit of getting imports from a large country, but if we see that if a number of partners work together, it's not that much more expensive to have a cooperative industrial base than it would be to buy from the large country. And this actually benefits both sides. Yes, the production costs might be slightly higher, but it does create a distinct second industrial base for both sides to draw on in the case of, in case they need to surge, for example, during a war, or if the United States turns to, pivots to the Pacific, then this also leaves Europe in a stronger position in terms of its own industrial base. Happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much for that deep dive into the economic logic of defense industrial issues. Over to you, Borja.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, it's great to be here because I tend to read your reports, guys, and they they get me through issues. I'm not because I'm not a you know, NATO wonk. I'm a political advisor at the External Action Service for Ukraine. So I'm going to bring some of this experience here because for me my role here is mostly question mapping. What is it that we want to do as NATO, and also how do we see the Russian threat shaping up in the next few years, because that will guide production. So I was just like browsing through my WhatsApp to identify that message that I received in early March, showing that the Ukrainians were running out of 120 millimeter mortar around Bakhmut, and you Americans didn't have apparently enough 120 mm at the time, and in Europe the Finns are producing, the Austrians are producing, but the Austrians don't sell. And so I had the question, can the Commission buy this? So in a way, Max, you anticipated some of the questions that it's nice to see an American talking about European policy, by the way, but it's great. I think that points to the future. No, but it shows the practicalities of some of the things we're talking. And as you know, the Ukrainians did a limited withdrawal from Bakhmut, then they reinforced their presence, but over time, they withdraw. They were not encircled by the Russians, but basically some of the gains that Russians have carried out in those months were precisely because the Russians had that advantage on mortars, because people are thinking of 155, but the units that the Russians are using more effectively that they tend to get credited for are these sort of small assault units that you cannot counter them with 155. You need 120 millimeters and things like that. So on those details actually hinges some of the things we're discussing. And so looking back, because you Alexander, you asked me about whether NATO has been adapting positively. I think it depends very much on what is it that we want to do, because essentially since 2014, and Jordan has mentioned it as well, we had on the one hand a policy on deterrence against Russia so that Russia doesn't go beyond Ukraine. That's Wales and the long list of commitments that have been mentioned. But then we other had a sort of creeping policy of support for Ukraine, incrementalist, gradually, so that Ukraine somehow will be able to defend itself. Now that policy, in hindsight, turned out to be very effective for the Ukrainians to actually put up a fight with NATO standards, not always NATO equipment, but NATO trained troops, etc. So the problem is that, we can, we're here in Brussels, no, but we can think that our deterrence policy is working, but it really depends on, what kind of Russia will emerge from this war. Someone has mentioned here that it plans to rearm. It will take a few years, but unfortunately, they're producing more missiles now than they were producing half a year ago, which has been a setback. How come they're producing 40, 60 missiles, some of them high precision as well, because they're busting sanctions. So what I want to say is that, and this takes me to Vilnius, is that inevitably, we try to say that, okay, but then there's the question of security guarantees for Ukraine. But if we fail on properly deterring Russia on Ukraine, I'm not so sure that our priority of deterring Russia will be as effective. And I'll explain why. Because basically, I was thinking, does Russia feel deterred? Someone has said, yeah, they don't, they're not shooting missiles at NATO, but we have a couple of examples of missiles that went astray, etc., in our borders. Clearly, they don't feel deterred on Ukraine at all. What we see is just military terrorism. Nova Kakhovka is an example of more things we're going to see over time. While they were freaking everyone about nuclear war, they were focusing on doing the things they do, conventional war and weaponizing destruction. And here I mentioned the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So what I'm trying to say is that we might feel safe here at home in Brussels, but it's like, you're having a party somewhere in the suburbs, but the streets are raging with fire and violence, etc., and inevitably it will creep over. So that's something we have to understand, which takes me to the question of incrementalism. I give a lot of credit to the Biden administration for the approach they have taken on incrementalism, because consensus has been key to keep that consensus as we were providing military support for Ukraine. But inevitably, we've lost great opportunities on the war, because we've been discussing the tanks for a year. Tanks came, and I haven't seen instances of World War III, rolling out, and we will send planes, but there will not be a World War III for that. But that has given the Russians incredible quality time to interest themselves, and now we're surprised that it's difficult for the Ukrainians to make progress, of course, because we should have done some of the things we're doing that. We should have done them in the fall, as some of us actually argued. On this same basis, I have an issue with, we talk about deterrence, but if you think of it, in NATO, we're great about doing self-deterrence. How often we talk about our own red lines. No, Ukrainians, please don't shoot targets in Russian territory with Western material. No, Ukrainians, of course, don't target the Russian leadership, because it will lead to escalation. We will not send flights. We will not send planes, etc. But we rarely set red lines for Russia, and of course that's an invitation for aggression, because that's the way this guy works. So, and that leads to the irony that Ukraine is not in NATO, but to be very frank here, they're doing part of the job that NATO was, was created for, through degrading the Russian military. So, when you ask about what more can we do, it really depends on what is it that we want to do. Because, first of all, for ourselves, there are two notions: production and readiness. And this we have to do it for ourselves. If we want to deter Russia in the mid to long term, there's a long list of things we have to do now, because at this rate, they might not rearm next year or in 2025, but I think they're in good shape to be a bigger threat later this decade, and Ukraine in ruins, no? Which takes me to Ukraine, and that's my mandate, and I will conclude here, of course. For Ukraine self-defense, the track number 2 that I mentioned, we're doing very good. Late, relatively late, but we're Western democracies. But we're doing security reassurances. We're providing packages, and Vilnius will see a lot of these things, but we're not doing security guarantees. And to this point that we don't do security guarantees, and we say only after the war, if I'm Russia, I think, okay, I will drag on the war. And I will drag on the war because it's, eventually the Westerners will get tired. So it depends whether we want to help Ukrainians defend themselves, and we're doing a great job in that regard, or if we want some kind of victory. And I conclude with some thoughts on production, although Max preempted most of them. But to me, the question, and I think it was Colin Cole, your Pentagon official, last August when everyone was on holidays and I was in Ukraine reading the Pentagon readouts, and he mentioned that our task is, our goal is to outproduce Russia. This is a war of attrition. It's other types of war. What is a war of attrition? Wars of attrition are basically two ways. One, bombing the enemy's factories. We are not doing that, but I think it makes sense for the Ukrainians to do that. But that's a way to degrade Russian military capacity, because otherwise they don't even need to enter Ukraine. They just bomb from outside with glided bombs. So that's for the Ukrainians to do, but that's one of the ways. And the other ways, it's production. The US, the EU, the UK, Canada, they're 22 times the GDP of Russia. So if we want to outproduce Russia, we can do that without any problem. The problem is that, and this takes me to Europeans, I agree that Europeans are stepping up, but inevitably, since Kyiv didn't fall in last winter, there's a very problematic sense of, okay, this seems to be under control, Russia cannot win, etc. And that, unfortunately, something really worries the Ukrainians, because Kyiv remains under threat, and Putin's goal remains to occupy the whole country. So what I will say is that, you mentioned the EU. I think the EU has and will have to play a bigger role come 2024, 2025, regardless of what happens in the presidential elections. The European Peace Facility has been mentioned. We need to make it long-term. We need to make it sustainable. And it cannot be that we have like around 12 German companies to produce ammunition. So we need to integrate. And I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Borja. Over to you, Gesine.
Where do I have to push? This one? Okay. Great. So, thank you very much to my co-speakers here for already giving the perfect base for what I'm going to speak about today, and particularly the last point, that the EU has to take more responsibility, because I really want to look at the Europeans and transatlantic responsibility sharing, or also burden sharing. And as you see already on this title slide, I think that the debates on strategic autonomy, even though the Americans often don't like it so much, and also some partners within the alliance and within the EU don't like that term so much, I think it's an important debate to have, particularly because we see some of it already in practice. When we look a bit at what has happened in the last, almost 1.5 years, 15, 16 months, then I would say that this prediction of, or this term of a geopolitical awakening that I think many of us have probably used in February 2022, but also that is still being reused in a lot of policy briefs and papers. I think we really see this strategic awakening, also insofar that the EU is now really using all its tools, that Europeans are realizing that they have to step up and that security is not for free. And we also see that what many people actually feared, that it's kind of a short wake-up call and then Europe will fall asleep again. We don't see that. And I think that's actually a very
positive development on the one hand, of course, for the Europeans, but also for the Transatlantic Alliance and also for the US, because there's probably no better partner than a capable partner in this regard. Okay, so maybe to dive into that a little bit more, I just want to quickly have a look at how Europeans basically have responded to that war. Because what I found particularly interesting is that although, yes, there were coordination problems, yes, there were problems to agree on a common approach, basically the European response to the war and also to burden sharing is pretty flexilateral. So flexilateral means you're implementing your policy or your policy choices on different levels. That can be unilateral. For example, that's what the UK did in the beginning, already starting to train soldiers, already starting also to arm Ukraine before things actually start. And also like providing bilateral development aid, providing bilateral support. So bilateral, like as a national response towards Ukraine. And then the other big ball on this here is the EU response, which then was also complemented by ad hoc formats of cooperation or like security ideas, initiatives that were pitched. We saw, for example, the European Sky Shield that has been launched, but also wider Europe with the European political community. And I think it's very remarkable to see how all these elements basically lead to the emergence of a European defense space, where we see de facto not only a European pillar within NATO, but rather NATO being one of the aspects through which Europeans contribute security. And that's also why I personally always advocate for the idea of abandoning this idea of having a European pillar in NATO, because European security cooperation is much larger and we have to think it in much more creative and flexible formats, because that is how states de facto also implement their security and defense policies. To look a bit at the burden sharing aspects, here's the graph that was already mentioned. It's important to say that this graph dates back to March or April, and that the next update of this Ukraine support tracker from the Kiel Institute is supposed to come out on the 6th of July, and that we also know that the support on the EU side is basically increasing or has increased, so that in total, when you're calculating together, or when you're taking together all the European support, so EU institutions, EU member states, and UK, and US support, it's slightly above the US support right now, which at least for the last numbers that I've seen, and I think that's very remarkable, because it shows on the one hand that Europeans are able to really leverage their tools, but also to rethink burden sharing. I mean, when you look at these numbers here, the orange one is military support, and there it's quite clear that the Europeans can barely live up to what the US is doing. But they also share their burden through leveraging other tools that can be used for coercion, for also like having an impact on the geopolitical situation. And I think it is important, or that is why it's very important, to rethink the entire debate of burden sharing also in defense, not only when it comes to who spends how much. And of course, like, I don't want to say that spending isn't important. Spending is absolutely crucial, but it's also important to think about, or to think a bit beyond only the spending debate. This is particularly what we say when it comes to the EU, because the EU is basically using a lot of different tools to respond to the war, and thereby contributes to transatlantic burden sharing, and also to create a European defense space and a European response to the war, and also to really take responsibility. And when you look at the different tools that the EU is using, so like the sanctions, then we have enlargement and integration, for example, also things like bringing Ukraine into connecting Europe. We have the peace facility that was already mentioned. We have the ISAP plan for procurement, a lot of microfinancial aid, the military training or advisory mission and all that. And the fact that it is now, I would say, pretty much the first time that the EU was able to combine all these tools into a relatively coherent response, for me looks pretty much like linking ends to a means, which in the definition of political scientists is strategy, and which, in my opinion, leads pretty much to the fact that we see something that one could describe as European strategic autonomy in practice, but we don't call it like that because that might fear some in the EU away. So basically we see that this ability to link means to ends and to also implement that on different levels, bilateral, multilateral, in the EU, in NATO, can really help and has really helped in the context of Ukraine, Europeans to take responsibility. And in fact, there are also, I would say, different factors that, to conclude kind of the panel presentations here and to give a bit the look forward, can help to European strategic autonomy and European responsibility to either fly off or to crash. That's what the rockets are for. So on the one hand, it is exactly what was mentioned. If Europeans are serious about taking responsibility and leveling up, then they have to be serious about funding and spending, and not only spending more. That is exactly what was mentioned before. It's also about spending better and just having better coordination and a more clever approach to funding, and not just putting the money out. It's also really about this idea of having enlargement as a complementary geostrategic tool, and also think about what enlargement can contribute to security and defense and burden sharing, because enlargement process will be a very costly thing for the EU, and might, however, also when, for example, reconstruction and enlargement is done correctly, really also contribute to strengthening Ukraine's capabilities. Implementation of the strategic compass, I think that's pretty much a no-brainer why that is necessary. And then, of course, there are also a few elements, and I would say these are also the elements that are in the hands of the member states on whether they get things done. This is the question of internal cohesion, the question of coordination, the willingness to do things together, also within the EU, because that's exactly what Max mentioned. The EU has the budget, it has the funding mechanisms, so why not do it? And I think that is also the clear advantage why these projects should be done within the EU. Of course, complementary with NATO, but when you already have the budget and the funding mechanisms, I don't see a good reason to do it within NATO instead of doing it in the EU and making it compatible and also making it interoperable with partners like the UK. And then, of course, there's the question, is European strategic autonomy, is it a bit of too French? Are we just having the same debate as we had it in 2018 again? So it's really about the political willingness to overcome that. But when we talk about European responsibility, and that also perfectly links to the title of this event, and then I close here, there are many external factors that Europeans will not be able to control, but should already preempt and potentially also think about potential damage control, which is, of course, the US elections, the scenario of a long war, and also the scenario, what if Russia wins? Because I have the impression that we, as Europeans, are not having these reflections sufficiently. Then there is also, of course, question of US-China competition, and the open question, what happens if there is a conflict in the southern neighborhood and Europeans have to reprioritize also to crisis management? A lot of questions, and I think I close to that and give it back to Alexander for potentially more questions.
Thank you very much, Jazine. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll open up the floor for questions in just a second, but let me perhaps already draw your attention to the fact that the European responsibility discussion really includes two distinct sub-discussions with very different reference. Because on the one hand, there is an ongoing debate that was referred to by many of our panelists on the long-term military support going to Ukraine, with the key risk to be managed being one of the supply side drying up, which ultimately brings us to the production capacity of the defense industrial base, both in North America and in Europe, which is, for a variety of institutional reasons, a discussion that takes place in US Congress. Here in Brussels also, a discussion that the European Commission engages in because it has earmarked R&D funding for restructuring the defense sector and so on and so forth. That is indeed the discussion that is drawing most of the attention to itself. But there is also another discussion operating in the background, which is really about European responsibility in shoring up NATO's own deterrence posture, and in particular ensuring that NATO's deterrence posture is robust enough to deal with a potential simultaneous contingency occurring in the Indo-Pacific, which would have the inevitable consequence of consuming much US military bandwidth, which would then ultimately require much more inputs from European armed forces. That is to say, European armed forces needing much larger force structures, which is an entirely different problem set that cannot be addressed through defense industrial issues alone, because it ultimately requires many more young European men and women ready to fight. It requires also, in terms of capabilities, things that we are not ready to hand over to the Ukrainians, perhaps things that we don't even have in sufficient amounts, such as long-range precision strike capabilities. The French president recently spoke about that in his Bratislava speech. It also requires leadership at the European and national level, that is to say, leaders that are ready to, if push comes to shove, bomb the Russian armed forces, if it comes to it, and are ready to sort of manage the escalation dynamics that would entail. And all those discussions about growing force structures, really rethinking the requirements of European armories, and all the political repercussions that brings us really in a much more exclusive NATO setting. Because, I mean, I like the business argument that you have presented, Max, but bear in mind, we have EU member states that consider nuclear deterrence to be illegal, which sort of puts a brake on how far you can go in terms of integrating things in an EU context. And I'm just picking up on one particular example. That by way of overall comment, bear in mind there are really two sub-debates taking place here at the same time. Let me turn over the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen, to come in and address any issues that you'd like to see our experts here assembled on the panel pick up on. And in the meantime, the panelists can already sort of think of what they want to respond to in terms of what has already been said. There is a flying mic in the room.
Great.
You're
Hello.
Over to you.
Good afternoon. Łukasz Jurczyszyn from the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Brussels office. Thank you so much for this really inspiring and fascinating interventions. It was really great. I have one comment, short comment, please, don't worry, short comment and one question. Borja, I will limit myself and I will leave my hawkish counter-Russia attitude for my intervention. I will speak on the second panel. But I think you're right that Russia doesn't seem to be deterred. And if we take into account the Belarusian vector of the Russian threat, namely to NATO, by announced employment of nuclear weapons on that territory, I will speak about that. So it's clearly sign that Russia is even escalating. So it doesn't feel deterred. The question, so I have two questions, sorry. One question is in regards to the European defense industry capacities. What, in your view, Max and Jordan, what in your view could be the right incentives for this industry? Because I was briefed in the Political Security Committee recently, so even the ammunition, this Estonia's great idea, you know, this will be really limited out of the plans. We can even finish around 300,000 missiles, you know, which is 1/3 of the plans that we anticipated. So it's really limited. So that's why there is this reluctance not only to indebt yourself, but you know to get rid of your stocks, for instance. And the second question is, Jessine, so please, could you more clearly explain maybe why there was this comeback of terminology of the European strategic autonomy? Because here in Brussels, I've learned that we moved to European responsibility, namely, and this notion of European strategic autonomy was, in a way, you know, it didn't work when you take into account these efforts to build with Russia, together with Russia, this new security architecture. I mean, in security terms, because in economic terms, you know, I agree that there are many positive points. But regarding security and all that Russian aggression against Ukraine showed, why we didn't stick to the European responsibility? And we came back to this debate, which we thought here it was quite over. Thank you so much.
Let's group a few questions. I see Louis wants to come in. And are there any other? Yeah.
No, I was going to say there are others. But just quickly following up on Alexander's observation / question on the challenges of resourcing deterrence and security in two regions simultaneously, which is something that we've been discussing quite a lot also with Max and CSIS colleagues, including last week in Washington, 2 weeks ago. So one question there, because and Cynthia, I really liked your. I mean, and Alexander made a point about particularly from a force structure and defense planning perspective, but there's also an industrial element to that conversation, right? And you were talking about the importance of ally shoring and friend shoring from a capacity viewpoint. So I was wondering, because a lot of the conversations that we have about how Europeans can facilitate a U.S. prioritization of China is by indirect means, right? By doing more in Europe. That's how Alexander put it himself, and I'll try to elaborate and unpack that from a force structure perspective later on in the second panel. But I was wondering how important, because you discussed the benefits of friendshoring from a Ukraine conflict viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of resourcing deterrence vis-a-vis China, how important can Europe's industrial capacity be? And second, and relatedly, I'm curious, because you focused your comments on an allied contribution to the European allies, but what kind of role can, again, from an industrial capacity viewpoint and a storage viewpoint, key allies in the Indo-Pacific, like Australia, Japan, ROK, play? Thanks.
And there was another question right over there.
Thanks so much. Oops. Hi, I'm Jenny Hayhurst from the UK delegation to NATO. Thank you very much for all of your introductory remarks. A few questions. So firstly, to Jordan, be really interested in your thoughts on the potential for a new defence industrial pledge, what that might look like, something that my colleagues are hard at work negotiating at the moment. I know for the UK, the ambition is to see the 2% enshrined as an enduring commitment and as a floor, not a ceiling, and to go beyond that as far as possible. To Cynthia, I have a question about what we can learn from how Ukraine has used civilian infrastructure to support defence production. So I know that there's lots of lessons to be learned by things like integrating 3D printing and civilian capabilities. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that. And finally, to Gesine, to just say thank you so much for talking about strategic autonomy and not just like admiring the problem and unpacking it, but giving us like concrete examples of maybe this thing has already happened and maybe we should like look at it as something that already exists rather than as something like purely academic and speculative. So just a comment rather than a question. Thank you so much.
All right, excellent. Are there any further questions at this stage? Tudor?
Thank you very much. Tudor Fabian, Policy Advisor in the European Parliament. Happy to be here. Thank you very much. So very quickly, just to Gesina's comments here in the end, I very much liked your provocative thought of potentially hinting towards a NATO pillar within the EU rather than an EU pillar within NATO. I added the sort of the next step. And I like your thought on burden sharing beyond simply military financing. So there were some previous conferences where we discussed the hybrid nature of this war, of a combination between a World War II sort of style conflict and a really 21st century war. So on these bits, looking at information warfare, looking at all the bits on the hybrid front, the EU could potentially really bring a consistent and solid contribution. But my question would rather go towards what we can do on the defense industry front. How can we balance between sort of off-the-shelf procurement and looking at autonomous capabilities? There's a lot of issues, for instance, also when we look at critical raw materials. Now there is this negotiation that we have with the United States on this front, because these are fundamental for our industrial development. But I'm wondering, what then are the incentives for the EU to really focus on autonomous capabilities when it might be rather easy to just buy off the shelf from third parties? Thanks a lot.
All right, shall we? There's one more question over there in the back.
Hi, I'll put myself up so you can see me all. I'm Ralph Breers. I'm from European Defence Agency, and I'm the head of unit for cooperation and planning. And I'm very interested in what has been elaborated on. Very interesting discussions and very good points brought forward. Just one thing that I wanted to add to this conversation is that in Europe we do have already some of the activities which are monitored, evaluated, and proposed to member states of cooperating in not only procurement, but also in capability defense development. And just to add a couple of things, a couple of thoughts to what has been brought to the table already, which is very interesting, is that we identified already since 2018 what the capability defensive development priorities should be in Europe, and what are the problems, because we have a coordinated annual review of defense in Europe, which means to evaluate where we live up to the standards and to the ambition that we have put forward in the European defense development. And in this particular point, I would like to say that collaborative opportunities within European member states, they come on a third place, because member states first look at their own ambition. What do they want to achieve? What is their capability development in the member states, incentivizing their industry? What do they need to live up to the NATO standards? And that leads then to the second priority, which are the NATO targets which are identified, which they have to live up to. And then eventually, if there is something in the European defense capability landscape that they miss, then they will address these points as well. So we do have an institution that is already monitoring this, identifying the priorities, checking with whether they live up to the priorities, and we come up with collaborative opportunities which we present to the nations, member states of Europe. So I wanted to add this on top of your discussion, just to mention that very interesting points, which I'm definitely going to take with me. But we do have also some institutions in Europe who are basically analyzing and quantifying these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Shall we perhaps go in the reverse order of the program, starting with you, Gesine?
Yes, does this mic work? Okay, brilliant. Okay, maybe I start with the question on why did we go back to strategic autonomy and don't talk about strategic responsibility. So as someone who's based in Paris, I can only say that the term strategic responsibility never made it to there. So basically, but the term that was basically, I think, used until, let's say, April and actually worked quite well was European sovereignty. Then Macron gave this interview talking about strategic autonomy again. Since then, we are there again. The thing is, the concept itself is the same. The concept is just you define European interests or you define European strategy based on genuine European interests, and you make your own approach, which is based on these European interests and not on US interests, basically. Strategic autonomy is nothing else. So basically, whether you name it strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, which was the term that the French introduced, particularly during the French presidency of the Council of the EU, doesn't matter. You can also call it a European responsibility, because what you need for that, and what you need for that in both cases is thinking about what do you want, and the second thing about what you need is how do we get there. So these are the two elements. I think that the European strategic autonomy approach, personally, I like this term of autonomy because it is about autonomous decision making, but it is not about independence. But in fact, you can call it responsibility, because responsibility is more the result. Why are we back to that? Also, I think because media really like mulling about the term and having these, in fact, often Franco-Polish debates who are a bit on the both ends of the spectrum. So that would be my explanation why we're back to that again. To the point, how can we balance off-the-shelf and autonomous capabilities? Maybe I take this one. Good question, and I have to say I'm not very optimistic in that regard, having read the German security strategy last week, which basically says we want capability harmonization, we want European procurement. Until that, I was like, okay, great, that's what I wanted to read, unless it harms capabilities. I mean, that's kind of logical, you want to maintain a certain level, but for me, this caveat so explicitly expressed, nevertheless, is really a manage your expectations approach. And I think that Europeans will continue to have a parallel approach on that. But of course, also that is a question of incentives. If you have incentives to produce more, to do more in like a European defense industrial base, to develop more together and so on, then you might have less incentives to buy off the shelf. But it's of course also a question of ad hoc availability at the moment.
Thank you. Borja?
Sure, but I'll have to be very brief. To the Polish colleague on the question of escalation, there's not a single instance of Russia escalating after the provision of Western assistance. There's every instance of Russia escalating anytime it's losing. And that explains Nova Kachovka and things like that. Which brings me to your point about whether, what if Russia wins? Fortunately, I think that option has been narrowed down if we understand winning as eliminating Russia as Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country. The problem is that Nova Kachovka is a harbinger of things to come. So it's a bit like the rapist. Like, if it's not my wife, I want to kill it. And that's really the way they think. And that's really, you just have to spend time in Russian Telegram channels to see how they talk about Kherson, etc. So it's not longer, Kherson is no longer mine, so I want to reduce Kherson to rubble. That's actually what we are going to see. And then maybe also for our American colleagues, I mean, I don't know if this expression, the proof is in the pudding. We'll have to catch up later this year and look at our respective ammunition production rates, because that will show whether we've been able, because we in the EU came up a little bit later than you, but not too embarrassingly late for EU standards with this ammunition initiative. It's gathering pace, but our defense agency colleagues know that well. There are hurdles in member states, commission, etc. So we'll have to find out whether we're able to ramp up our production, because that is really quite decisive for how the war will run. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of really, really good questions. Just in terms of munitions and the ramp up of production, one thing we have to sort of reflect on is, why are we in this position where we clearly don't have enough munitions? And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they don't last forever. You fill the factory and they have to be maintained, and eventually they become out of date. But also, more broadly in the US at least, munitions are sort of the ugly stepchild of defense acquisition. You have priorities, they have higher priority programs, and so if they need to fill a budget hole, munitions are an easy place to take from them. They don't have the same support in Congress that other sort of higher profile programs do. So you just say, all right, we're going to buy 100,000 less or however many less, and we'll make up for that next year. And then they never do because the other priorities come along again. And we can criticize the decision makers of the past, but really the question is balancing priorities, and it's not just that munitions are our priority, they clearly are, but there's a lot of defense priorities, and it's easy to say they've made a mistake, but the question is always, what would you have given up in the past to buy more munitions? And that is a much more difficult question. A second question made me think that we really have to think of the industrial base in two capacities. One is the producer of the military equipment that we need to wage war, but secondly, in bigger picture, it's also part of deterrence. If we show that we can pull our industrial base together to counter our adversaries, that sends a message to potential future adversaries that they might want to think twice before they get into a war with the allies, because we'll work together to produce what's needed to fight back. So that is not something that the U.S. can do alone. One of the questions asked about what happens if the U.S. has a Pacific pivot. That's clearly something that is quite a worrisome question. And the idea is, you know, the solutions are too. The U.S. has to consider its own industrial base and how to make it as strong as possible, which includes, by the way, thinking about it from a supply chain perspective, not just from a prime contractor perspective. But second, it's really thinking about Europe and how to support European investment in its own industrial base rather than just trying to sell weapons there, which decreases the incentives of Europe to invest itself. And I think that is a much bigger policy question that I've talked about with Max in the past. And really we have to think about defense sales from a big picture perspective, not from a short term, yeah, this is great for industry perspective. Another question looked at pulling in civilian infrastructure, 3D manufacturing, and so forth. What Russia's war in Ukraine has done is create an existential war for Ukraine. So I'm assuming that every part of their economy that they can pull in to fight, they're doing so because they have no choice. War can lead to innovation. It can lead to things like UASs used in new ways. 3D printing is certainly something that has been discussed, especially for parts manufacture in expeditionary environments, so you can deploy without having every part you need. You just bring a 3D printer and the necessary substrate. So to the extent that the Ukrainians are engaging in innovation, this will help them going forward, but will also create potential new capabilities for allies to use if there's future warfare. Over.
Thank you. Over to you, Max.
Great. Well, first, let me just say thank you to Cynthia, because it's great working with her at CSIS, and I've learned a ton. I think maybe just on the defense industrial question, I think this is a real dilemma, right? Poland gives away huge, fleets of Soviet-era tanks, needs to backfill. Where can it buy? Okay, there's a U.S. production line of Abrams. There's a Korean production line. And so having to weigh the kind of short-term off-the-shelf versus longer-term potential European solutions is a real dilemma. I don't think I think there's not necessarily a right or wrong decision. I think both perspectives. So the French perspective of Europe should be able to build 155 ammunition in Europe actually makes a lot of sense. And investing in that capability, even if it takes a little bit longer, may be worthwhile. On the other hand, you need that ammo on the battlefield tomorrow. So I think those dilemmas are playing out. I think the answer is not one or the other answers. definitely both. And let me just say, there will be a reason and a logic to buy U.S. weapon systems because they're battle-proven, they're exceptional, they tend to be top-notch. The point I think the United States needs to start thinking about, and I can say this as someone, the arms sales decisions actually rest in the State Department because arms sales are supposed to advance the foreign policy interests of the United States ultimately. And never in that calculation of whether we're for or against an arms sale and whether we're going to submit that to Congress for approval, did we ever consider the impact that a sale might have on the European defense industrial base and whether that was something we even cared about? And the answer was probably we didn't care because, like, who cares? More market share for American companies. But I can tell you, if Poland buys American, it doesn't make Article 5 any more ironclad than if they chose a French system. And I think that that's where the actual foreign policy impact of our sales, when we sell to India, it makes a big difference. You're helping to sort of undergird a strategic relationship, but we're already treaty allies. And I think we need to start having a bit more of a strategic focus when it comes to buying, when it comes to arms sales and also defense investments. And that's where the emphasis on European defense collaboration, I think, is really important, not just for Europe, but for the United States, and something the United States should emphasize. And then maybe just a quick point on European strategic autonomy in the American perspective. I can say the American perspective is always hostile to European strategic autonomy. On the other hand, the American perspective, I think in my view, and as we outline in this new report, is contradictory. On the one hand, the United States wants to maintain its indispensable role in European security. That is a fundamental tenet of American foreign policy. On the other hand, we complain endlessly about Europe's lack of capabilities, about Europe's dependence on the United States for anything to happen when it comes to European militaries. And I think there's a growing strategic problem, and that is that the United States has pivoted toward Asia. And that pivot to Asia is not really away from Europe. In fact, I think we're engaging Europe in a more strategic way than we did probably during the post-9/11 period. But we don't care about the Middle East and North Africa anymore. It's, if you look at the national security strategy, the one that came out in September versus previous ones of maybe the pre-COVID era, the Middle East and Africa are much higher, especially North Africa. The era of counterterrorism, we're front and center focused on European security threats, on counterterrorism. That is just not the focus of the United States. So if there's a humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan and there's a need to do an intervention, that still might be possible, right? The era of potentially intervening in a crisis situation has, despite the fact that we don't want to think about it anymore, may not be completely over. Who is that going to? Who is going to do that mission? And I'm pretty sure it's not going to be the United States leading. And this was one of the issues that was being raised before the French pulled out of the Sahel. So I think Europe will need to have capabilities so it can act. And maybe one final point is that the United States is engaging the EU more directly than ever before, in part because the world has changed, because the tools that nation states in Europe had given to the EU when it came to negotiating trade agreements, when it came to tech and regulation, well, guess what? Those are the tools in which China policy is determined. So why did the Biden administration come in really focused on the US-EU Trade and Tech Council? It wasn't because they really wanted to work with the EU. It's because they recognized that the EU as a bloc is the same size economy as the United States and China. And ergo, who has much of the policy for determining what is a European strategy and approach toward China? Well, it's happening with Ursula von der Leyen at the EU level. And so I think part of this is figuring out the European strategic autonomy. It's happening. And it's now about how do we leverage what the tools that the EU has fundamentally to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance and to strengthen NATO. And I think that's really the EU using its tools and capabilities to figure out how to get European countries to start building the capabilities more together so it can start acting a bit more as Europe, whether that's defending Europe on the front lines in deterring Russia or doing interventions abroad.
Thank you. Over to you, Jordan.
I'm very excited by these questions. Thank you for asking them. So I'm looking at my notes. I think I'm going to start with Jenny's question about what you call the defense industrial pledge. Well, I was wondering if there was, you have your finger on the pulse. I was wondering, is there a new name or was that a Freudian slip? Either way, I like it. And it's obviously quite germane to this. It was like my Norway slip earlier, similar. So it's appropriate in the context of this conversation. I liked it. So I that is in the front of my mind. And I think I'm going to answer it by way of answering Łukasz's questions about my notes for Łukasz's questions are basically debts and stocks. Those are the two items I have there. And then Fabian's question, which I think is very related, Tudor's question, which I think is very, very related. This question of off-the-shelf versus building a defense industrial base, which I think my colleagues have touched on. So first, this question about debts and stocks. Stocks is a really important question, and I think especially in light of what Cynthia was talking about munitions being the ugly stepchild of the defense industrial base. And it's even more interesting in the NATO context because munitions, and we're talking about defense investment as like a general thing, but munitions are counted by NATO as O&M expenditures, and end item equipment is counted as equipment expenditures, and the Defense Investment Pledge covers equipment expenditures. And what we're essentially asking one another to do, whether it's the floor or a ceiling or whatever, is by saying we ought to spend 2% of GDP on defense and 20% of defense budgets on equipment, we're saying we ought to spend 0.4% of GDP on equipment. That's like the Defense Investment Pledge is really just one thing by, the property of transmutation or whatever it's called in algebra. So I think that's really important when we talk about stocks, because I think when we're talking about stocks, we're mostly talking about munitions. And I'd like to illustrate my thoughts on that by telling a war story. I don't tell war stories very often, but picture it. I'm a platoon leader in Iraq in late 2003. It's just starting to get violent, and my platoon gets in a big gunfight. We come back to our base. We're kind of recovering our equipment after the gunfight, and we're all kind of cleaning weapons. And there's one guy who's playing, PlayStation or whatever. It was a long time ago. We had very primitive stuff. And everyone kind of looks at him, and I'm like, hey, dude, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I didn't shoot. It was like a record scratch moment. So you do not want to be the guy with a large stock of ammunition when there's a war on. And this idea, and we make this mistake in the United States, and people have made this argument strategically that, oh God, we're expending stocks that we should have for China in Ukraine. Well, I mean, I won't name the person who's saying that, but you're basically the guy who's in the tent after the gunfight saying like, oh, I'm saving my ammunition for the Taiwan contingency. No, what you're told when you're a professional gunfighter is shoot your ammunition and we'll give you more. And it goes to the point that Tudor was raising, like how do you send a demand signal to the defense industrial base? Is you kill the enemy with the ammunition that they're making, and then they'll make you some more because you're paying for it. If you say like, oh, we got to keep this in warehouses for a contingency, they'll say like, okay, well, let me know when you expend it, and I'll make you some more. So sorry for that somewhat emotional appeal to expending ammunition, but I have an inclination to expend ammunition for a purpose. So stocks are an important question. But then also this question of debts and stocks. And I think you, Łukasz, may have been referring to sort of end item equipment in that context as well. And this kind of brings me back to the comment that Max made earlier about why is the United States not pushing the EU, the EU institutions to have a debt facility for military purposes. And to address that, I have to explain one small thing about my research program, which is that it's different than most of the rest of the people on the panel. I do these really boring, data-intensive papers that have to have causal identification strategies, and I get yelled at about it by economists, and it takes like 3 years from the time I write a paper till the time it gets published. But this was interesting when I was working at US NATO because I'd have working papers which I could just convince my colleagues at US NATO or in the interagency were correct, before the economists that read them out in the world thought they were correct, and we could try it, right? So a paper that finally came out in 2019, I'd written it in 2016, and I found that as NATO allies incorporated SGP fiscal rules into their domestic legislation, their spending on equipment decreased. So basically there was a real constraint, like SGP constraints acted as real constraints, okay? So I convinced Ambassador Lute and Bob Bell that was true, and we raised it with the interagency, and we had this big conversation that included, naturally, the embassy in Berlin and US-EU. And there was, I don't recall anybody being concerned about, like what we were advocating for, we were calling it carve-outs at that time. The team in Washington came up with that phrase. We were calling it carve-outs for defense expenditures under the Maastricht criteria. And really, we lost the argument. We, US NATO, lost the argument. And the argument ender was, in fact, came from US-EU. And it was the person making the argument told us he was an economist. A problem that I have is I don't look like an economist. I try to dress like one, though. That was a joke at my own expense. But the argument that he made was, he said, I'm an economist, and this is a basic guns versus butter issue, and the Europeans prefer butter. I don't think that's at all clear, and we now have some survey experiments that indicate it's not clear. But you're right that fiscal rules are a real constraint, but only under certain conditions. And I think the U.S. has some ability to shape those conditions. And I think there's emerging academic research that supports that. And then another paper that I wrote back in 2016 and is still only a working paper, I recently updated the working paper, and Cynthia's seen this paper, and I found up until 2019 that European countries, essentially the larger their existing defense industrial base was, the more they were inclined to spend on equipment. And that held from prior to 2000 up until 2019. But what I found is I've revisited that paper that I wrote back in 2016 or 2019 and have been revisiting, is that relationship has attenuated significantly in recent years. So my best guess about why that happened is that the actual strategic environment has driven Europeans, even if they don't have a significant defense industrial base, to invest a little bit more in equipment. And this is, I think, the problem that Tudor's raising and that others have raised. And the problem there is that the argument that my German colleagues would always make in the 2014 to 2017 period was, we'd be trying to push them to spend more on defense. They'd say, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. We have this big problem right now where basically our defense industrial base doesn't have the pipes. Like even if we spent more, it would just all be wasted, and we don't have the pipes aren't big enough to take all of that. And we'll have enough early warning in a crisis where we can fix that. Well, I think we know today that was a bad argument. That was a mistake, right? And even the United States, as Cynthia showed us, has this problem that it's hard to get that stuff going again, especially if you're stocking ammunition instead of shooting it. So you really do go to war with the resources that you have. And so my view is that these sort of like institutional machinations between NATO and the EU are really, really, really important, because if we're barely getting by thanks to Russian incompetence in the current crisis, I'm quite concerned about the next crisis. And I don't think it's necessarily on the U.S. And I wouldn't, as a European, I wouldn't depend on the U.S. to say, to suddenly have this moment of enlightenment and say, we need to support the European defense industrial base by sort of turning down the spigots on our defense industrial base, because in the long run, it's in our interest. That might be an enlightened, self-interested way of approaching it, and maybe we'll get there, but I would not count on it if I were a European strategist. I'd start using my stuff and sending a demand signal to the European defense industrial base, and start replenishing my stocks that I'm sending to Ukraine, and start using my equipment, repairing my equipment. And it doesn't have to, you don't have to throw it at the battlefields in Ukraine. Train more, use more gas, break your trucks more, use your stuff. That would be my sort of strategic advice if I were a consultant hired to do that. I have so much more on my mind, but that's it. I think I've taken too much time already. Thank you for those wonderful questions. Those are really those questions really got at what I think is the essence of the issues we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Let me just quickly scan the room to see whether there are very urgent questions that still need to be addressed. If not, I will gently proceed to drawing this very insightful and rich panel conclusion to its end. Perhaps wrapping up with two thoughts. One primarily for the US-based audience and another for the primarily Europe-based audience. For the US-based audience, I think it would be relevant to have a close look at what is actually going on in European defense budgets, because pretty much irrespective of where you look, defense budgets have typically already doubled, are planned to triple or quadruple from where they were when the defense investment pledge was signed in 2014. So if you would translate that to what is actually the volume of the DoD budget, that would sort of mean going from where it is today, below $1 trillion to over $3 trillion. So there are really pretty mind-boggling changes that we are seeing here, and that is perhaps not always sufficiently accounted for in DC debates, where Europeans may still carry this image of being free riders. Where, I mean, admittedly there are some exceptions here and there, but by and large the trend is up, and it's a big trend that we haven't seen for many years. In particular, also including the largest budgets in Europe. For the European audiences, as we were discussing European strategic autonomy extensively in this discussion, it's probably also educational to know where that idea of autonomy came from, and it has actually very deep roots in French strategic thinking, ultimately going back all the way to the intuition of General de Gaulle in the 1950s, who famously was convinced that in time of emergency, one can never rely even on one's closest allies. Now, the logical consequence of that is, if we really want European strategic autonomy, we need to ensure that all EU member states grow their own independent nuclear arsenal, which may not be a short-term prospect. But it is also useful to bear in mind, before the present war escalated, basically half of the European capitals were telling the other half that they were paranoid about Russia. And obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, they were wrong, both on substance and even more in terms of telling other capitals what to think. But then, of course, if one starts wondering, why aren't the Central and Eastern and Northern European countries necessarily buying French or buying German? Well, it might have one thing or two to do with what had happened in the run-up to the war. So if we are serious about European strategic culture, we would do well to listen more carefully to one another. I'll leave it at that and thank all of our speakers on the panel for brilliant remarks and thought-provoking contributions. There is coffee waiting for us outside, so let me invite all of you in joining me in a round of applause for our excellent interventions, and then please join us for coffee right outside.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this exciting event co-hosted between CSDS and CSIS. My name is Sissy Martinez, and I am a researcher with the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Public Diplomacy Division at NATO headquarters, for making this conference possible. The focus of our discussion for this panel will be on the rapidly evolving competitive environment we find ourselves taking place not only in Europe, but all over the world. We will also discuss its implications for NATO and what role the alliance could play, especially as we prepare for the Vilnius Summit next month. Given the topic, I'm excited to have here Nicola De Santis, Lucas Jorkashin, and Luis Simon. Quick background on our panelists. First with us today, and in no particular order, we have Nicola De Santis. Nicola has held the post of Head of Engagements in the Public Diplomacy Division at NATO headquarters in Brussels since 2019. Mr. De Santis is responsible for leading and managing the Alliance's public diplomacy activities and programs to promote a better understanding of NATO, its values, policies, and activities, fostering dialogue and cooperation with relevant audiences in NATO and partner countries. Prior to that, he was for 9 years the head of the Middle East and North Africa section in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division. Notably, Nicola has worked for NATO for over 30 years. I can't think of someone better to have here talking about NATO ahead of Vilnius, so thank you for joining us today. Second, we have Lucas Jorkashin. Lucas is the director for the Brussels office at the Polish Institute for International Affairs here in Brussels. His areas of expertise are in all things EU and NATO concerning security and defense. Prior to his role, Lucas was an analyst for France in the Weimar Triangle program at PISM. In addition to his post at PISM, Lucas serves as national coordinator of the European Commission's DARE study on counter-radicalization and terrorism policies in the EU, and an expert at the Radicalization Awareness Network, or RAN, Center of Excellence at the European Commission. Last but not least, we have Luis Simon. Luis is the director of the Research Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy, CSDS, and a research professor in international security here at the Brussels School of Governance. He's also the director of the Brussels office of the Elcano Royal Institute and a non-resident senior associate with our Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS. His current research interests include the evolution of U.S. geostrategy and its impact upon the transatlantic relationship, European geopolitics and security, the future of NATO, and the changing geostrategic dynamics in Asia and their implications for Europe. So thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start the discussion just by asking one question, and the question is this: what is NATO's role in weathering the current competitive environment we find ourselves? If there is a role for NATO, what is it? And Nicola, let's start. I'd like to start with you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I want to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy of VFU, for being partners with us. The question you're making comes at a particular moment because we're living, I think, a transformational time in transatlantic relations, but also I would say as far as the international security environment that we're living today is taking shape. NATO, during the last 30 years, worked actively to build a new security order, a transatlantic security order with the end of the Cold War, which was inclusive rather than exclusive. In other words, we brought together countries which were going to become, decided to become members of the alliance, members of the European Union, but also partners as diverse as countries in North Africa, in the Arab Gulf, in the eastern part of the alliance, on the Balkans. And Russia was included in the security equation since 1991. In the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, Russia was, in November 1991, was one of the members. There were practical cooperation being developed. 1994, the Partnership for Peace, which had three important features: democratic control of the armed forces, transparency of defense budget, and interoperability. Russia was included. In 1997, we developed a permanent joint councils. Yeltsin and then Secretary General Solana gave rise to a forum for political dialogue and practical cooperation. The Founding Act was a document signed by both NATO and the Russian Federation with a number of areas, very specific, but where there was joint decision making. So much the cooperation was developing. And not many people remember, I bet, also in the audience, that NATO in Bosnia, when the United Nations Security Council gave a resolution to implement the military aspects of the Dayton Accord, that operation was done having Russian forces under NATO military command. We had in shape months, 1 hour drive from Brussels in the most secretive, if you wish, military headquarters of the alliance, the strategic headquarters, a Russian planning cell with the military people working together side by side with NATO. In Kosovo, the Russians didn't agree with NATO with their campaign. In fact, they blocked the UN Security Council resolution, which then we had to deploy the Kosovo force. Again, the Russians were on the ground together with NATO. Then, 2002, Putin comes to the Rome Summit, and he signs off to the partnership, to the NATO Founding Act. And in 2002, the Permanent Joint Council, from a bilateral body between NATO and Russia, becomes the NATO-Russia Council on a multilateral level. So much had been NATO engaged, not only the emergence of the democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, all of the successor states for the former Soviet Union, but Russia itself. Then in 2007, Mr. Putin goes to the Munich Security Conference, and with the astonishment of all those present, uses the same language of the Cold War. The West is obsolete, the world is dominated by one power, the United States, and you know, we need to have a new security order in Europe. In just 1 year, it was in Georgia, in 2008, in 2014, unfortunately Crimea, and today a shattered peace in Europe by attacking in an unprovoked way and in an unjustified way a sovereign nation, when he had subscribed in Rome to the principle of the Founding Act, among that respecting the territorial and sovereignty of states. So much has changed in European security. But there's not only that. The emerging disruptive technologies, the fact that now autocratic states, and I would say the revolutionary impact of new technologies, the world that which we have made more global, more independent, and which has brought with it, of course, a lot of fruit of this interdependence, brings with it a lot of security challenges, hybrid challenges, the coercive use of political, economic, financial tools, but also the moving security challenges and even confrontation through new domains from the traditional one we have today, cyber, for example. We have space. We have the information space, again, with the revolutionary technologies, which brings us on one hand closer together, but increase vulnerability. So the way in which NATO is trying to cope with this was clearly stated 1 year ago. We approved the new strategic concept, where the three core security tasks of the alliance, deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security, which means working and enhancing the cooperation with our partners across the globe, will help dealing with these new challenges. The role of NATO is to deter conflicts in all domains, but should conflict happen, then the alliance is ready to defend its members. We made it clear. We continue to make clear in all different aspects of the evolution of today's security environment. And we're doing this also, bringing together, mobilizing partners so that they can develop the resilience, those defense capabilities which will help them deal and be more resilient vis-a-vis these new security challenges and threats. I'll stop here. You gave me a few minutes. I hope I try to synthesize at best what you asked me to do. Thank you.
That was perfect. Thank you. Lucas, we'll go to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to discuss these timely and important issues among such experts and friends. So going straight to the business, to tackle your question, Sisi, as a Polish expert, you know, I won't surprise you that by underlining that NATO has a central role, and it will play this role in this on many levels in this war that will be determined by power rivalry and collective security stakes rather than economic ones. That was the case for the last 30 years of accelerated globalization. So with no doubt, we are witnessing a real rebirth of NATO in its traditional collective defense role. And it was due to the Russian, namely, aggression against Ukraine that undermined this post-Cold War international order. And my very point is that even though that there is a more and more central rivalry between US and China, and that will be growing, I'm sure that we're going to come back to this point later on, Russia will stay the key security threat to NATO. So if you ask me what will be the role of NATO, for me, for sure, it will be to securize Russia's neighbors, the closest neighbors. And of course, until Russia will abandon its imperial policy. That's why it's necessary to develop and strengthen the new architecture to ensure the long-term security of particularly these neighbors, and to bolster NATO and US capability to defend against Russia. And this first and urgent pillar, in my view, of such a system must be a sovereign Ukraine. Ukraine that can defend itself and with support, of course, of its allies, with a credible guarantees, security guarantees. Of course, ideally based on the NATO membership. Let's be honest, that's the real guarantee that could be provided only by the alliance. But in my view, as I am a huge, long-established fan of NBA, like maybe some of you here, so for me, Ukraine's membership must be a Michael Jordan's 1998 last shot for Chicago Bulls, like a decisive moment to secure the victory over Russia. So although we look in details, we just talked about in the previous panel in details, in depth, about the lack of capabilities and not enough spending on defense by NATO members, and that's really a huge issue. According to our data, and they are maybe updated looking at Jordan now, but according to our data, half of NATO's 31 members now are unlikely to increase defense spending up to 2% of GDP by 2024. So this increases the risk, and this is I would like to stress on that, this really increases the risk that they will use these countries, the temporary weakening of Russia, and freezing maybe of the conflict in Ukraine, and not as an opportunity like we do in Poland for sure, but to make necessary investments, but as a pretext to stop them or maybe to delay. This is a huge problem, and worth noting that defense spending in the countries from the Eastern Bloc, of course, gradually growing, but it's not only about that. We've been modernizing our armed forces, and in the case of Poland, it's around 30% now. So we doubled our spending for GDP, and we are doubling our modernization processes, which is, of course, linked to the fact that we are exchanging our arms from post-Soviet to the Western modern new stuff, new equipment. And my last. The second point, which won't be neither shockingly surprising for you, I think it's really important, this determination that we will show to achieve this major element, in my view, to deter Russia efficiently. It to get rid of this self-limitation. I mean here, which are contained in the NATO-Russia Funding Act. So in my view, in Vilnius, we need to bury this dead act, which, of course, I think, unfortunately, is not likely to happen, with, of course, its consequences, very, very crucial consequences. And it can be expected, in our opinion, that Russia will even demand NATO observe the self-limitations contained in this act as one of the conditions for ending these hostilities produced in Ukraine, which will make even more this act even more divisive document as it is now or up to now. So I think it's very serious because in a long term, Russia may interpret that the lack of rejection of this act will be a signal that the states from the eastern flank, they have a different security status than the rest of the alliance. It is very serious because we go back to this list of ultimatum sent by Russia in December 2021 in order to briefly establish in this region NATO gray zone or buffer zone. So I will stop here, maybe underlining the practical level that if we are agreed, to bury this act, I think it should lead to the transformation of the battlegrounds by the country that, of course, are commanding this battle groups in our region, and to adopt new plans and to transform them into brigade, and that would be, in our opinion, for sure, more efficient deterrence of Russia. Let's start it in the short term and in the medium term. Thank you.
Thank you. Luis, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Sissy. Great to be sharing this panel with Nicola and Lucas. And thanks for the great question. So following up on that, we know that Russia's, and we were just talking about this a couple of weeks ago in Washington, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has generated an intense debate in the United States about how to reconcile the immediate need to help Ukraine and strengthen European security with the need to focus on China, which is all over the national security strategy and the national defense strategy in the United States, and address the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific, right? And for some people, we're all following the U.S. debate. For some people, the Biden administration's strong support of a war in Europe sort of strains U.S. diplomatic, military, and industrial resources and stands on the way of a much-needed prioritization of China. But other people are arguing instead that it's important to stand on principles, whether it's on Europe, in Europe or the Indo-Pacific, and also underscoring the synergies between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, in the sense that the war in Ukraine can help revive U.S. and allied defense industrial capacity, and we were talking about that in the previous panel, but also generate important operational lessons and help revitalize transatlantic, trans-Pacific, and cross-regional partnerships as well, right? And some people in Europe, I realize, may argue that this whole debate about how to deal with strategic competition in two fronts simultaneously is a U.S. debate, and that Europeans should actually look at the world through their own lens and not just adopt U.S. concepts and U.S. frames. But I would actually say that this is not just a U.S. problem. It's a problem for all those whose security is invested in U.S. military power and in the international order that we have today. And ever since World War II, U.S. military power has actually played a very important, even structuring role in Europe, in Euro-Atlantic security, and even in Europe's geopolitical architecture. And today, the main threat to U.S. Military power specifically, and even to international order, you may argue, comes from the Indo-Pacific, not Europe, the most structural, right? And in a way, if the United States fails to meet that threat or that challenge, then the entire architecture built around U.S. military power would suffer. And that means that America's success in the Indo-Pacific is in the European interest. And the U.S. prioritizing, although it might sound ironic, but the U.S. prioritizing the Indo-Pacific actually is in the European interest. And this is why the question of how Europeans, and NATO specifically, can contribute to a better management of this two-front predicament will actually be very important, even central to transatlantic relations in the coming years. I think taking these debates as a point of departure, I would actually put two questions out there. One is, how can Europeans, and we were talking about this, Alexander Matelar brought it up in the previous panel, how can Europeans help free up U.S. strategic bandwidth in Europe so as to enable indirectly a more serious U.S. rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific without weakening Europe's deterrence architecture? And secondly, in what ways, if at all, and there's a big if there, can Europeans contribute to upholding, however modestly, to upholding deterrence in the Indo-Pacific? And of course, there's another question, which is, how can Europeans do more to contribute to security elsewhere, including in the so-called southern neighborhood? I'm not going to get there. Nicola knows all about it, by the way. But I'll just focus on the first question. which is how can Europeans, just a few strokes here, how can Europeans help free up U.S. resources or strategic bandwidth to enable a proper rebalancing towards the Indo-Pacific without weakening Europe's deterrence architecture? I think answering that question actually requires making some assumptions about how U.S. force posture and defense strategy in Europe may evolve over the coming decade. This is, of course, very, very difficult because, it gets mixed up with questions related to U.S. domestic politics, with how the war in Ukraine evolves, how China's pace of development in terms of military modernization and so on. But we must try and make those assumptions anyway. And I would perhaps highlight the following ideas. The first is that I believe Europeans should prepare for a U.S. approach, and this is regardless of whether there's a change of administration next year, 2025 rather. I think that Europeans should prepare for a U.S. approach to force structure and force posture that prioritizes the China threat in the Indo-Pacific and deprioritizes Europe, regardless of whether current developments in Eastern Europe may hinder or delay that prospect in the short term. The second is that Europeans have to either step up their contribution to deterrence or otherwise put down with more insecurity in and around Europe. And the third, and this is something that I believe, but I realize that there are different ideas out there, is that a number of factors, including bureaucratic inertia, ideological reasons, legacy capabilities, a number of factors underscore the reality of some form of U.S. conventional military contribution to European security for the foreseeable future. So these arguments that the U.S. should cut down radically in Europe, I don't think that's likely. So concretely, I think this means that the landing space, if you will, for U.S. force posture in Europe will probably be somewhere below the post-2022 surge in terms of troop levels, but above simply providing Europe with nuclear cover, which is what some people have been arguing in Washington. So if we take that assumption as a point of departure, and I'm wrapping up here, I would distinguish between sort of two sets of functions from a deterrence viewpoint that need to be delivered in Europe. And I think we should think about transatlantic burden sharing in the context of those two functions. The first is the provision of strategic cover and the enabling of deterrence, so the kind of big ticket assets that you need for that. And the second is a direct contribution to deterrence in the front line in Eastern Europe. And Lucas was just talking about that. When it comes to strategic capabilities like nuclear, BMD, command and control, ISR, I would expect the United States to continue to play a leading role. I think Europeans should prepare to step up in many, if not most, of these areas, including nuclear, but without undermining the principle of U.S. leadership, which I think is a precondition for rebalancing in those strategic areas. And the second key point relates to a direct contribution to conventional deterrence and defense in the Eastern European frontline. And here I see the potential for a much more radical rebalancing in terms of burden sharing and for Europeans to actually take the lead. However, I would argue, going back to the previous point, that it's still important for the U.S. to maintain some form of conventional military role and presence, not just for assurance purposes, which is very important for Eastern Europeans in particular, but also to manage escalation dynamics and avoid entanglement risks and manage the dynamic with Russia. I'll leave it there. Happy to elaborate a bit more later or talk about it in the Pacific.
Of course. Thank you, Luis. Fascinating from our entire panel. And thank you for bringing up the big China question, the big elephant in the room. From a U.S. perspective, we constantly hear that, that Russia is the thunderstorm and that China is the climate change. And the fact that Europeans are starting to really consider, okay, what is this the U.S. pivot to China, what does this mean for us? This is very important. This is a conversation that we should be having now more than ever. But Nicola, I have a question for you because there's been talk about expanding NATO's mandate just beyond the North Atlantic. There were discussions of opening an office in Japan, but there wasn't consensus within the alliance. And the more that we talk about, okay, how can Europe be involved in the Indo-Pacific without, I guess, being so grand? But I'm curious to hear what the debate is like at NATO right now surrounding this. Is there an appetite for European member states to want to contribute to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, the decision has been taken. The issue is how do we bring up the modernization of NATO in the perspective of the Vilnius Summit. We made it clear in the strategic concept. For the first time, we had 4 strategic concepts during the Cold War, which were classified. November 1991, in the post-Cold War security environment, NATO made it public, the strategic concept, for the first time. And so we have had 4 strategic concepts during the last 30 years. And in the last one, last year, China is mentioned for the first time. So while on one end we say that we are ready to have a constructive relationship with China, which is based upon predictability, transparency, and therefore predictability to safeguard the interests of the alliance, we have also clarified that China is a source of concern for the whole of the alliance, because it is whole of the heads of state and government which approved the strategic concept. It is all of the heads of state and government which will meet in Vilnius in just 1 month and a half to decide how to further implement the decisions of the Madrid Summit and the guidelines, if you want, the strategic vision outlines in the strategic concept. So we've said clearly, China is a source of concern because it uses hybrid tools. It uses political, economic, financial, technological tools as a form of coercion to move countries in the direction that it suits China, which is to change the rule-based international order. That order, that the fundamental principles of the Washington Treaty, democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law, are shared by the US and Canada as much as the European countries. Now, both of you have posed questions, but I would like to say, talking about the Europeans, the United States, well, NATO is the transatlantic alliance where the United States, together with Canada, meets with European countries, and it is there where we have decided this major modernization. So I'll come back to you, but let me also address what Luis said. When you talk about the levels of conventional forces, when you talk about how we're going to redesign the presence also of NATO in conventional terms. Not only we had this major reinforcement of 40,000 troops at the borders of the eastern members of the alliance, because we had to take into account this new reality, the fact that Russia had invaded a country, a sovereign country, and was threatening, is threatening European peace, but we also made it clear, you were talking about the battle group, that we will bring it up to the level of brigades where necessary. In other words, NATO has to retain the flexibility to adapt according to the different scenarios that can be produced. We hope that containment will work, but should it fail, should deterrence fail, the alliance will be ready to protect every inch of its territory. We made it clear in so many speeches and in so many statements, in so many decisions. So the idea now of having regional plans to be adopted by heads of state and government in Vilnius means tailor the defense to the territory, the different parts of the area of competence of NATO, therefore the NATO's territory. These will be tailored, and the force structure, as much as the command and control, will reflect this tailoring that the heads of state and government are supposed to approve. With regard to China, we said we want a constructive relationship, but we're very much concerned. What is this? Why is China not making clear what is this major modernization of its military structure is about? The new technologies which is employing, the modernization, hypersonic, the fact that also the nuclear arsenal, which, by the way, it's outside any of the arms control agreement, it remains opaque, we said in the strategic concept, vis-a-vis their intention. Why is it doing so? Why is it building these larger transport ships? They say they have a lot of migrants worldwide, and if there is a conflict, they have to go and pick them up. Well, I come from a country, Rome, where the Roman Empire used to send the engineers to the provinces, but then it would send the legions. So we don't know. So we want to understand better why China is doing this. But why is it using hybrid tool? Why is it doing cyber attacks? Why is it, therefore, having an aggressive posture? Why does it use a confrontational rhetoric? Again, it is like with Russia. We said with Russia we don't want any confrontation, but we have to take into account the facts. And the facts are that we have war in Europe again, a war that we thought would never end. The big hope of the post-Cold War security environment have been shattered. And therefore, a security organization, you, the public, want a security organization to look at the security challenges wherever they come from and also the threats and deal with them. This is what we call the 360-degree approach, to which we look at the area of competence of the Washington Treaty, which means members, but also we look at areas of strategic interest of the alliance, the areas where we have a lot of partners which share with us common security challenges and threats. And we want, together with them, work in order to understand all of the things that I've discussed so far. So make a kind of, let's say, strategic awareness and share this strategic awareness not only with partner countries, but also with partner organizations, the EU. The complementarity, the increased complementarity between NATO and the EU that we have seen, it's the key for the success. Because if we look at hybrid challenges and threats, for example, this encompasses political, economic, financial tools, technological. Therefore, the complementarity in addition to military ones. That is why it's another area where complementarity between NATO and the European Union will be important to mobilize resources, but also to share a common understanding of these challenges and threats, but also the trends. Where are we going and how do we have to adapt our systems so that we can better deal with these challenges, both in terms of deterrence, but should deterrence fail, also to deal with them.
Thank you. And I also just want to say to the panel, if you ever want to jump in to comment, please feel free. I can't. Go ahead.
If I can, I want to. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. So I just wanted to first in the Pacific question, but I also wanted to react to the last point that Nicola made. So on the Indo-Pacific, I think we need to distinguish between Europe's contribution and what NATO itself as an institution can do, right? Because they are related, but they're different topics, right? In the sense that some European allies, certainly the United Kingdom, also to some extent France, believe they can play a role when it comes to security in the Indo-Pacific, but they don't think, particularly the French, as we know, that NATO is necessarily the best venue for doing that. And they think NATO should focus on the Euro-Atlantic. So taking that caveat, which is a political caveat, you want to? Yeah. So taking that caveat, which is a political caveat, as a point of departure, then the question is, what is left for NATO's Indo-Pacific agenda? Right, or for NATO's China's agenda, and Nicola has been making some points. And the typical response today is that we can still engage in global cooperation with AP4 or IP4 countries. So there's this assertion that the Indo-Pacific is a big deal, that China's strategic rise is a big deal, but NATO still appears to be framing cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners in generic or even transnational terms, right? And focusing on things like cyber, like resilience, and so on. And I think this, for some people, I'm not saying that I'm one of those people, but for some people this can generate some confusion and even a sense of hollowness about NATO's Indo-Pacific agenda, right? Because a lot of expectations have been raised. And I think this all has to do with a legacy reflex and the fact that the foundations for NATO's dialogue with global partners were set in an Afghanistan context when the emphasis was more on transnational challenges like terrorism, external crisis management, and so on. But now, the key issue for everyone, not just for the Japanese, for the Australians, for the Koreans, for us Europeans, for the Americans, is strategic competition, is deterrence in a peer or near peer competitor context. And the main concern of both of us is strengthening deterrence and generating the forces, the operational concepts, the capabilities, the technologies required for deterrence. So I think, in my mind, the key challenge, the key question for NATO's Indo-Pacific and China agenda is how do we reconcile the need to rebalance the NATO AP4 conversation by putting strategic competition and deterrence at the center, with the political caveat of not having NATO engaged directly militarily in the Indo-Pacific, which is fair game because it's a political reality, right? I think this is the right question. And I think that the NATO AP4 conversation needs to move beyond transnational, 1990s kind of reference, and put strategic competition and deterrence front and center. So I think that this is, and there's already some movement in that direction, but I think there's quite a bit of work to do.
Well, I want to reassure you with regard to this, because there is more than movement. I mean, we are now strengthening the cooperation with the 4 partners in the Indo-Pacific. We not only have political dialogue and political consultations, we are developing individual, tailored, practical cooperation programs. And they are looking at the common challenges and threats, the cyber domain, space. We're looking at the emerging disruptive technologies. This is not something, a little cooperation, because of course, the impact of emerging disruptive technologies on the security of NATO member countries and on our partners in the Pacific is huge. And it has important ramifications. Even the issue of hybrid warfare, for example, which, by the way, China theorized in 1999. It's not something new. We're trying to adapt now to this new thinking. But what they used to call the unrestricted warfare, the fact that warfare is not only in the military domain, but goes on the economic, the social, the disinformation. Look at the issue of disinformation, which can undermine the cohesion of alliances, but it can also undermine, through confusion, the democratic states, for example, because it confuses the population and it erodes the support of the people towards the state structures, towards the government. So these are things that we're looking together with our partners. In Vilnius, we're going to strengthen this even further. In fact, the partners will be invited, to Vilnius, and there will be other important decisions in this direction. Just to say that it is important to share this approach with the countries. And I would say there are two dimensions. I don't see a dichotomy, I have to say, Louis, like you mentioned, the idea that some European countries, of course, some European member countries of NATO wants to have, like it's normal, a bilateral track vis-a-vis China. But there is consensus in NATO to strengthen this cooperation. China is fully now in the political discourse of NATO, but also it's looking at ways in which the core security functions of NATO can be adapted, but also study together with partners what kind of cooperation we can have together in these areas which represent challenges in security terms to all of us.
Yeah, very shortly, in regard to China and to your main question, why China is doing that and what exactly has been doing. I think it's extremely important, and I don't want to pretend, to be a China expert, but we have smart people, in our team that has been working on China. Quite recently, they're just coming back from Shanghai, and we've been producing papers on the China-Russia cooperation. We are not shy about that. So publicly, we will pronounce our concerns about this growing partnership, and that's why European External Action Service, for instance, invited us to co-organize such a conference, which was the first conference we had with EAS, namely because we're observing that very closely. So we need to respond very quickly to this question, because when we look at the breakthrough in the Chinese foreign policy, when we look the fact that after so many years of economic, political cooperation with the West, with the European Union and bilaterally, somehow China decided to support Russia in its illegal criminal attack against sovereign country. It's a big step. No matter what we can hear in the communication level, and no matter the peace talk initiatives, which are important, but when we look in details, what are the proposals? Ukrainians, they're not happy about that, to say at least. So we need to, I think, be very careful and not make the same mistakes that we did with Russia, in my view, not to be illusional about that. So in our view, on the one hand, China has been instrumentalizing the weakening of Russia, and we can see it very clearly in Central Asia. So China is trying, to use this context, this new context that Russia has been losing their influence there. Slowly, but it will take time. Not to mention all these energy deals, very interesting for China in cooperation with Russia, etc. But on the other hand, we think that China cannot afford that Russia will lose this war. That's why it's supposed politically, economically, and we'll see what will be the outcomes of the Ukrainians' counteroffensive. And now we can even observe some examples of military support. It's a small support. There are some drone parts, there are some small amount of rifles, but we will see what will happen when Russia will be even more weakened military. So we need to really observe that and react accordingly to this situation. And the second point. Regarding this division of labor between U.S. and European allies. I think we need to really, it's necessary to clarify this division of responsibilities because in related both to defense of the treaty area and wider international security architecture. When we need to work on the practical implementation of the strategy, that's be in interest of the U.S., to convince the allies to respond to the challenges from China through, for instance, this hybrid threats you mentioned, Nicola. So that would allow, for instance, when we start this discussion, strengthening of deterrence against hybrid actions and cyber attacks, which according to the NATO doctrine may lead to the invocation of Article 5, for instance.
First Article 4.
Then, of course, yeah, but even.
And then even
yeah.
Article 4.
So smart division of labor, and I agree that we need to have these discussions more and more.
The only thing I just want to stress, because of the sensitivity and the very difficult transitional phase we're doing, we have to be very careful when we talk about the United States, the Europeans, avoid undermining, the transatlantic dimension. We need to avoid the decoupling. One thing is the complementarity between institutions, between NATO, which again brings together Europeans and North Americans, and the European Union, which has a different kind of raison d'etre. And another one is to make this distinction. The place where the United States and Europe come together and harmonize their security policies must remain NATO. We need to avoid decoupling transatlantic security. This would be a big mistake, both for Europe and for North America. And I don't see a trend in that direction.
And you wanted to comment, so.
Sure, I mean I do, but if you want to open it up. I just wanted to comment on the previous point. Go back to Nicola's point about maintaining flexibility, which sort of relates to what Lucas was saying about battalions versus brigades. Because, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine has sort of vindicated those Central and Eastern European countries who've been warning for years now about Russia's revisionist and aggressive intentions. Warnings which, by the way, were often met with skepticism in some places. Having said that, Russia's underwhelming military performance in Ukraine so far has also raised questions about its ability to pose a serious conventional military threat to NATO territory in the short term. So there's a bit of a gap in terms of how Russia is perceived now, more aggressive than some thought, but also less capable than many assumed, right? So, and that gap between intentions and capabilities I think has had a mixed impact on NATO's deterrence agenda in the eastern flank, right? In the sense that shortly after the invasion, and Lucas, I think, was touching on that, there was a lot of discussion about the need for a qualitative leap in terms of NATO's military presence in the eastern flank, the need to terminate the NATO-Russia Founding Act, even discussions about deploying theater-range conventional missiles missiles in the east. Some people in Washington were making that argument. And I think those calls for such a qualitative leap were informed by the assumption that Russia's, if you allow me the expression, bite on Ukrainian territory or sovereignty would be much more significant than it has turned out to be, at least so far, right? And in the sense that a collapse of the Ukrainian government or even Moscow's occupation of the south would have put Russian forces in direct or almost direct contact with NATO territory. But so far, however, Russia's military performance in Ukraine has been underwhelming, and Russian forces are by and large confined and indeed swamped in eastern Ukraine. So as a result, NATO's reinforcement strategy and agenda has so far been rather progressive. Basically, what we got in Madrid was enhanced forward presence plus. If you will. But as Nicola was saying, I thought that point was important. There has been movement, and NATO still has options and should have the flexibility to scale up depending on how the situation evolves. Having said that, and this is my last point, I think Ukraine's impressive ability to keep Russian forces at bay, at least so far, I think has persuaded many, not just in NATO, but also elsewhere, that supporting Ukraine's effort might actually be the best and most efficient way to contain Russia's geopolitical push westwards right now.
I would like to take a quick pivot because I also want to acknowledge that China, the Indo-Pacific, is not the only arena for geostrategic competition. Max and I just came from Norway the past few days, and we've been talking a lot about the high north, the Arctic. I feel like I'd be very remiss in not mentioning the high north, just because when I think about arenas for even future potential for tensions, the high north is one of them. I think of Svalbard, especially with Sweden and Finland joining. And of course, we can also tie China in because China sees itself as a Arctic observer. I'm curious to hear how is the alliance thinking of just the growing cooperation with China and Russia, especially when it comes to the Arctic, because of course with the war in Ukraine, there's that, but we also have to think Russia cares deeply about the high north, about the Arctic, and I think if anything, that region is a region that they will struggle with the most when it comes to potential weakening of power. So I'd be curious to hear from you, Nicola, Lucas, Luis, any comments here?
Yeah, look, only 5 years ago, nobody would have had a debate in Sweden or Finland about joining the alliance. It is clear that after the military aggression against Ukraine, this process has been accelerated. And the idea of regional plans is this one. Look at different regions, high north being a priority, and also looking at the nexus between China and Russia. This is something that we need to take into consideration. There are some very concerning signals, but it is something that we need to deepen and that we need to pay attention. The idea of regional plans is exactly this one, looking at how you will defend all allied territory in a security environment which is changing very rapidly. And that is why the discussion that defense ministers have had only last week and that we will have in preparation of the Vilnius Summit goes into adopting this new model of regional plans, which also would be accompanied by new command and control, but also a new force posture, which will take into account the evolution of the European, but also international security environment in all domains, the traditional ones, but also cyberspace, information space, cyberspace, but also space. Where also there, the issue of China is an issue which is quite relevant because the challenges that China can pose in space are a reason of concern.
I mean, we are very happy that Finland joined NATO. We are looking forward to seeing Sweden very soon, because really changed the strategic situation in the Baltic Sea. You know, from our perspective, it's in the favor of NATO. That will be in the favor of NATO even more with Sweden, and that will change a lot. You know, and that's the deterrence, the sufficient deterrence I was talking about. Also in terms of this huge long border between Russian Federation and Finland, 1,400 kilometers, and I think in the processes for weakening Russia, we should expect more hybrid threats and hybrid aggressions. And we've been witnessing that on our border, which is smaller than that with Finland, and that's Lithuania and Latvia the same. We had this test, and we still find it challenging. It's an important experience, I think, what is going on at our borders in that sense. There is a new momentum. I just told you for a while, changing the subject with the Belarusian vector. It's a link with this hybrid threat, because this new momentum of the challenge from the Belarusian vector of Russia's threat to NATO. It's triple, yeah. It's hybrid. What we need to witness with the instrumentalization of the migrants. It's we will see how this border between Russia and Finland could be used. There is, of course, nuclear character of this challenge. We had recently a great exchange at NATO headquarters about this, namely Belarusian vector of Russia's threat to NATO, because that's changed situation. On the one hand, doesn't change because Iskanders, you know, they in the approachment of NATO for years. But on the other side, look at that. We need to really look at this problem as the clear Russian acceleration of threat in our region. But look at that, how once this nuclear arms employed in Belarus, maybe they are already there, you know, I don't know, they will be there. A little movements of these missiles, exercises, the permanent employment of Russian soldiers in this facility, it will be going straight to the news programs, you know, and it will provoke crisis after communication crisis after crisis in the form of escalating by Russia nuclear threats. You know, it will be really, really. We are expecting, you know, this new context soon, yeah, I will stop that on that. You know. But I would like to underline, you know, this new situation that we're gonna face.
Thank you. The difficulty with the topic that we were given is that you can go into so many different directions, and there's only so much time, because I think we could talk about this for hours, and we only touched on a few subjects. But I also want to open it up to Q&A to the audience. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes. I don't know if we have a mic going around. Yeah. There's one right there.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm Roman from Florence, the School of Transnational Governance, and I'm doing my traineeship here in Brussels. And I had a question to Mr. DeSantis. So from your words, it seemed like we have done everything right with Russia, that we have included them in the security architecture. We wanted to engage them more, especially Germany. I wanted to ask you more on a critical view, what could we have done better towards Russia, and what have we done wrong? Because I feel like since I'm doing my traineeship here, I have never had this discussion with people here, so it would be nice to hear your view.
Look, it takes two to tango. You cannot force a country to go in the direction where you would like it to be. You know, I think NATO has done so much to build the new security order with the end of the Cold War. As I said at the Rome Summit in November 1991, not only we revised the strategic concept, taking into account all of the changes which had happened in Europe. We were coming out from the INF agreements, only a few years before between Gorbachev and Reagan, which eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons in Europe. You know, the conventional threat had receded. So NATO opened up to all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, all of the successor states of the former Soviet Union. And as I said at the beginning, our security concept since then has been inclusive rather than exclusive. It was not aimed at marginalizing anybody, but rather to call all of the countries in Europe to build a new security order of peace on the continent. When NATO established the North Atlantic Cooperation Council right after the Rome Summit in 1991, Russia was included. When NATO developed the Partnership for Peace program, Russia was included. I remember that at the time some were saying, how far wants to go NATO with this inclusiveness? Does he want to replace what it was called at the time the CSIS, now the OSCE? No, it was a different way in which in the security sphere this idea and now we'll continue. Can I go now? I can scream if you want. Should I? It's not going to be. It's working now. Let me handle it. I'll handle it with care. The table one. Which one is working? Okay, because this. Okay. Give me one word. So what I was saying is that we tried so much to include Russia, and you know, I really don't concede to anybody saying NATO could have done better, because better than including Russia in all of the cooperative frameworks that we developed, the cooperative security, you know, this idea of partnership was developed as early as 1991, which then has become a permanent core security task since then. Russia was included, was included in the Partnership for Peace. The Permanent Joint Council in 1997 with Boris Yeltsin and Solana identified that this document, the Founding Act, if you go and read it, what more cooperation could you have done with a country which would not become a member of NATO? And I would say Putin signed off to it, because at Pratica di Mare, this, you know, a few days ago Berlusconi died, and there was this image all over Europe of him with George Bush and Putin. And in Rome, well, they were transforming the Permanent Joint Council into the NATO-Russia Council. And Putin signed off to all of this, but he walked back. And unfortunately, we cannot do anything about it. But I must say that we kept alive the NATO-Russia Council up until a few days before the invasion, when Russia, remember, Russia started talking about, we're doing an exercise. And then with the ISR, with the intelligence, we told them, look, this doesn't look like an exercise. The capabilities that you're putting in an aggressive posture, which means ready to invade, do not look like that. And then they started with the special military operation and then the invasion. And we didn't suspend the NATO-Russia Council up until that moment. What more we could have done? Nothing more, because it was the responsibility of Putin to shatter peace, to invade the sovereign countries, and to deliberately target civilians. This is not a war. This war of aggression is not a war between armies. It's the deliberate attempt to kill children, elderly people, the civilian population, for which he will have to respond to the international tribunal.
Thank you for your question. Does anybody else have a question? Or Jesse?
Thank you. I would like to maybe ask you a question regarding another theater of strategic competition, which is Africa. I mean, we see more and more that basically, and that was also mentioned in a previous panel, that the US are not considering the MENA region in general or not prioritizing it more precisely. But we also see that on the one hand, China, Russia are very important partners there. But we've also seen that, for example, in Mali, with Europeans, yes, going out, Russia coming in, or more like Russia coming in and then the others coming out, now MINUSMA being pushed out. And I would wonder, how do you think NATO can or should prioritize there, also given a certain, the fact that resources, on the one hand, really in terms of man-woman power, but also in terms of capabilities and money to some, and also time and political ability to prioritize are somehow limited. So how to choose the priorities and how to think about, or how to develop a burden sharing approach in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, I can say something, but this is Nicola knows all about it because he's been working on the MENA region at NATO before PDD. So I'll just say a few things on this. I think that's a very good point. I think there are two issues here that I think will result in NATO / the West adapting its approach towards the South, like broadly understood, and that probably also in some way includes Afghanistan. But more specifically the MENA region and the Sahel that you touched on. One has to do with the fact that prioritization has been, priority is being given to other theaters, not only Europe, but also the Indo-Pacific, and the fact that these are sort of the centers of gravity of great power strategic competition, or primary theaters, if you will. The second has to do with intervention fatigue, which is a post-Afghanistan. Afghanistan and the way in which the withdrawal unfolded illustrates that, but it's deeper than that. Also, with the French in Mali, the fact that interventions have not yielded the results that many expected. So I think those two trends are sort of conspiring, if you will, to incentivize NATO, Europeans and Americans to think differently about how they engage. They will continue to engage, but more politically, through the whole capacity building framework and so on and so forth. Having said that, as you said, it is a theater in strategic competition, and we are looking at the southern neighborhood broadly defined, and that goes for the Sahel, Mali, you touched on Mali, where the Russians have been very much present, also North Africa. The Middle East, look what's going on there also in terms of Chinese presence, and in Africa more broadly, but also Central Asia. So it is a theater of strategic competition, and strategic competition is being used more and more as a hook to redefine the way in which we talk about that region. But also I think we need to be careful and not have strategic competition be the only lens through which we look at the southern neighborhood specifically, right? Because there are other challenges and other dynamics at play. I'll leave it at that for now, but I think that is one area in which Europeans in particular, given where US priorities are heading, can play a more and more important role, both through the NATO outfit, but also through the European Union bilaterally and so on and so forth.
No, and I'll take it from where we left it. In fact, the issue is not limited to the strategic competition. It is since 1994 that NATO developed cooperation with countries in North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean in the Middle East. It is since 2004 that it developed cooperation with Arab countries in the Arab Gulf. And we have a regional center in Kuwait where countries from the region come and work together on programs which have to do with defense capacity building, making the countries, modernize their defense and security institutions. So this is work which has been going on, now 25 years, it will be next year, with the Mediterranean Dialogue, and 20 with the Arab Gulf states in the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. But what you're saying, you're right. Clearly, there is presence of Russia, there's presence of China in the region, and in this transformational time, we have to be more vigilant, because I think we should avoid in that area the fact that countries may choose to opt with the West for security and with technology and the economy with autocratic states. So That is why also there, the complementarity between NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, the initiative of the G5 Sahel, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership of the European Union. I think there are now areas of further complementarity, institutional complementarity, that must be explored. And I think that our partners in the region are becoming more and more aware of this. They want to share with us more awareness on the hybrid threats, for example, the fact that countries which are in difficult economic conditions can become the victim of political and economic and also energy blackmail in a moment in which the region is also complicating by the adverse implications of climate change, which can have a security impact. Think to access to water, for example, which is crucial. Think the access of energy. So this is something which is very clear within the alliance, and it is the reason why we're intensifying the political dialogue with our regional partners to look also at these new security dimensions.
Very important question. Thank you for that. I'm definitely in line with Luis, what you said, that this is the area that the European Union should be more active in, especially in terms of the fight against disinformation and to be more offensive with the information campaigns. So this is happening, but I think we need to strengthen these initiatives. And second point, regarding the counter-hybrid threats in this region, just come back to the point with the Belarus. I think here also we need to remember that NATO and EU, namely, should cooperate more, in countering hybrid threats on that border. That will be this European pillar in NATO, in my opinion, very efficient when you look at the growing initiatives at the Euro side with the EU hybrid toolbox. There are many things that are now happening at the Euro side and European Union side that can be a matter of cooperation. Returning to Africa, we cannot afford anymore, I think, because it's a serious situation. We cannot afford that the countries like France was isolated, for many years. And, in that sense, they were right about that. And I think it's a turning point from the eastern flank perspective because it involves Russia now. Yeah? It involves Russia now. The money that is gaining illegally or illegally there by the Wagner group, look at that. In spite of all difficulties that Russian military has been passing through at the Ukrainian front, they didn't stop their operations in Africa, even they enlarged. When you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, we are all afraid that Chad will be the next. We need to act more. From the military perspective, I think there was a missed opportunity for sure, and it will be very hard in this context to mobilize a similar coalition that France and Germany in some period of time has succeeded to organize with G5, Sahel. All this initiative wasn't really successful because of the lack of investment and maybe encouragement, for the broader group of the European countries. That should stop because, it involves us and it will involve us even more, with the migration pressure and this terrorist threat from that region. But I think at least this disinformation tools and that could be quite effective,
I think we have time for one more question, or we can do both of them and we'll do a rapid fire round.
Thank you very much. I'm Ivan Zaccagnini, PhD student in Luis Guido Carli University at Rome. I would like to come back to Ukrainian war, and in particular I would like you to spend some words about the possible outcome of this war, because at this stage I see three options. The first one, of course, is a victory of Ukrainian forces and NATO forces. But in this case, it will be very important how we will achieve that victory, because history is telling about that. The second option, of course, is the worst case scenario, that is a Russian victory. But there is also a third option that is something like a frozen conflict. So I would like you to, what do you expect about that and how to address such scenarios? Thank you.
Thank you. We can also get the... No, you can ask it, and then we'll just do a rapid fire.
I have a question for Lucas. You've already underlined the importance of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what Louis at the beginning said about that it's in Europe's interest that the US prioritizes the Indo-Pacific region. I wondered whether you could elaborate a bit the Polish perspective on this, and whether enough is, like, what perhaps other European militaries could do to in terms of assurance and deterrence, and basically what your perspective is here.
Okay, look, I don't want to speculate on the outcome of this conflict. Firstly, because I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows how this conflict will end. I think we have an hope that this, first of all, there are some positive elements. The positive element is that Ukraine, with the help of NATO allies and building on the collaboration that it developed, the interoperability through the Partnership for Peace for many, many years within the alliance, is resisting, the Russian invasion in ways that nobody, I think, would have expected. So for me, this is the first success story, the containment of the Russian invasion. And I think, we will see in the next months how the outcome on the ground will go into the direction in allowing us to answer the question that you've made. But there is one thing here. It will end the negotiations the way Ukraine wants. It will have to end with Ukraine, which is a sovereign country, which is independent, which is free, and will have to be at peace. And that is why any negotiations will have to have this ultimate goal. And nobody should take decisions for Ukraine. It is up to Ukraine to decide how it wants to end this war. But hopefully, this war will end like all other wars, at the negotiating table with a free, independent Ukraine.
Lucas, we can go.
Yeah, okay. To make a story short regarding the scenarios, so this is this momentum that I'm going to be hawkish, what I promised. So I think there is no way, to negotiate with Russia. No agreement will be respected. Any agreement you can imagine under this leadership, that will be respected by Russia. So the only way we can get rid of and exit from this terrible situation is to support Ukraine until Ukraine will turn back the whole territory under the treaties. And so I will really repeat Zbigniew Brzezinski famous phrase, he was repeating that all the time. Don't trust Russia. Don't trust Russia. And he was right. And I mean, under this leadership, we should lose any illusions that the deals, agreements will be respected, because the goal of current Russian leadership is to eat Ukraine, is to create a buffer zone at eastern flank in our region, and to get rid of United States, from the European security architecture. And regarding Taiwan, this is a very interesting question, because there was a Taiwanese representation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs recently in Warsaw. I think Taiwan, when we talk about Indo-Pacific and eventual possible conflict in the Taiwan Strait, I think they can count in our region for two things. I will go back to United States, but I'm stick to the small country that can be eaten by the larger neighbor, and we are really attached to such kind of difficult situation. So they can count on our support regarding the presence of Taiwanese case in the public sphere in Poland. It's rising. If you look at the news, it never happened. It's far away, but for the public opinion, for the political elites, now it appears like a case, because there is this comparison with Ukraine and with our case that we need to support a weaker part, in this possible conflict. When you have a aggressive neighbor on your frontiers. And so they can count on our presence in our public sphere. They can count on our moral support, and they use it, Taiwanese themselves. They say that they can count because we understand the situation. And with the United States, as I maybe didn't underline very clearly, but we think for today that the best way to protect Taiwan, it's to deter Russia in Ukraine. So it's clear, and for us, China has been observing, namely this situation. How we're going to deal this conflict to the end. And when Russia will be weakened, I think they will see, this efficient deterrence from our side. They won't risk attacking Taiwan, in my view.
Thank you, Lucas. Luis, I don't know if you want to give any final.
Just super briefly on the scenarios question. Look, the three scenarios you outlined, of course, make sense from an ideal type perspective, and it's true that we don't know what's going to happen. I would just echo what Nicola was saying about the success in containing Russia's invasion, and I think that taking that as a referent, we should just keep calm and carry on. There's been a lot of speculation about a long war not being in the U.S. interest or in the European interest or in NATO's interest. You may have seen the RAND Corporation report. I'm not so sure, it all depends on what you make out of it and how you behave. Certainly Putin is banking on the fact that Russia is a national security state and is therefore mentally ready to endure a long war economically, socially, politically, and the West is not, or that's what he thinks, right? Whether he's right or not depends on what we do, I think. And that connects to a broader point, which is that we are now in a completely different world, and our societies and states, I think, need to switch into a wartime mentality and pace, industrially, economically. We're talking about that in the previous panel, politically. If we do that, I think we'll have an excellent foundation to indeed have a diplomatic solution, but to do that from a position of strength and security.
Thank you, Luis. And thank you to this panel for being here with us today. I hope everyone got to take away some good food for thought. I know I did, especially ahead of Vilnius next month. All that's on my mind is thinking, okay, what are we going to see next month in terms of enhanced cooperation? The new force model, I'll be curious to see how that is, but also thinking about enhancing deterrence, but also making sure to keep this equal balance on maintaining or creating this competitive mindset within the alliance when it comes to China and Russia, because I think that can also create a path, lead us to an even more dangerous path down the road. But again, thank you so much for being here with us, and I want to applaud you all, so thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. This is, I know Luis and I will close us out. We won't talk very long because it's near 5 o'clock and it's sunny outside in Brussels. Let me just say, today is also a federal holiday in the United States. It's Juneteenth, where we celebrate the end of slavery in the United States, and I think it's demonstrates that wars change things. They change things in sometimes very dramatic ways. And there's a war right now in Europe, and we don't know the course of that war. I think we have a lot of potential ability to direct its course, obviously through the support we're providing Ukraine, but that can change the future direction of history. And I think because of that, it demonstrates the importance of maintaining our transatlantic collaboration as we sort of navigate an uncertain future where the world could change in a very abrupt ways or may not, and we need to solidify where we are. And I want to thank NATO for their support for being able to have these events today, and we'll have future ones in Europe, because maintaining that correspondence, I think, is fundamentally critical. And as we talked about strategic autonomy in the opening panel, I'm not too worried about the future direction of Europe leading to decoupling in part because we have so much in common, particularly as we face increasingly autocratic threats around the world. But with that, I want to thank Luis and CSDS for hosting and for doing a phenomenal job today. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Just to echo Max's words, this has been a terrific event, great panels. Sissy, thanks to our speakers in both panels, and to NATO PDD and Nicola, of course, for the support. It's been great to partner with you, Max, and we really look forward to the follow-on event in Washington in the fall. So thank you all for coming out, and wishing you a good evening. Thank you.